Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 267 to 284. Chapter 267 Honoria's Diary. The giant oak doors of the bedroom shut behind the white-haired princess, where she proceeded to latch them. Honoria had a broad smile on her pretty face. She had just returned home after a long journey, and she had big plans for tomorrow. The young woman held her chest as she thought about tomorrow. She could feel butterflies within her heart. After taking a few moments to calm herself, Honoria pulled out a large, leather-bound book from within her pouch. This book was chestnut in color and had a strap around it that was secured with a lock. After reaching further into her bag and finding the key, she unlocked it before placing it down upon her desk that had gathered dust in her absence. After unbuckling the book, the princess gazed upon its contents. Since her arrival in Kufstein over a year ago, she had begun to keep a diary that contained her daily events. As such, she began to flip through the pages reading through her past experiences while living under Berengar's roof. Some of these made her smile, and others made her frown. It had been quite the emotional journey while staying in Kufstein. After flipping through the initial pages, she found herself reading about her experience shortly after Adela's 14th birthday party. The journal entry read as follows. September 10, 1418. I awoke in the morning to find myself with a splitting headache. I had far too much wine to drink last night. I don't remember my actions from the night prior, but Berengar began glaring at me since the moment he first saw me. I had a relaxed breakfast alongside Berengar and the other guests who stayed within the castle of Graz, which I vomited up shortly after. Note to self: greasy food does not settle well with a hungover stomach. Later in the afternoon, Berengar visited me and chastised me for my behavior the night before. Though I do not remember behaving in such a manner, I was slightly violent with him out of jealousy towards the attention he showed to the other girls. It serves him right, he doesn't notice me enough. Am I not worthy of his praise? Upon reading this entry, Honoria smiled bitterly, to think even back then, she was having problems with her relationship with Berengar. Not wanting to dwell on the topic, she quickly flipped through her pages to find the following passage of interest. October 5, 1418. I have been learning to sail for some time now and have gotten quite good at it. Berengar has even promised to take me to Istria in the summer so that I can learn to sail on the sea. I am so excited I can hardly wait. After going through my daily sailing training, Berengar has given me a new task. He wants me to learn how to shoot and wield a sword to defend myself properly. I am not sure how good I will be at the task, but it makes sense. After all, some of the sailors have been eyeing me with ill intent. If not for fear of what Berengar might do to them, I dread the idea of what might happen to me. Luckily Berengar wields enough respect that they seem to contain their lecherous nature. Then again, is it respect or fear that drives these men to behave themselves? I suppose I should ask around and see what the people under Berengar's rule think of him. Honoria fondly gazed upon this specific entry. It was one of the many moments Berengar had shown that he cared for the girl. However, the good times had lasted for such a short period. The beautiful young princess shook her head of such thoughts before flipping the page and moving on to the following central point in her diary. October 15, 1418. Today is Linda's birthday, and Berengar has spent the entire day with Lind and their son Hans. The little tyke is so adorable. I wonder if I can have a son as cute as him one day. Wouldn't it be great if he looked like Berengar? What am I saying? It is now past noon, and Berengar has barely spoken to me. Instead, he and Lind have spent the last few hours locked away in their room. I think they are having sex. I don't know why, but that makes me so jealous. I know I shouldn't be thinking such things, but every time I walk by their room and hear Linda's pleasurable moans, I can't help but think what it would be like if I were in her position. Evening came, and at dinner, Lind announced she was pregnant, not only to Berengar but all of the guests who came to visit. Her birthday is a big deal since she is Berengar's lover. Even Adela and her family arrived. I am certain that his little fiancée appeared just as envious as I was when she heard the news. Berengar seemed so happy that it made me bitter. I wonder how he would react if I were to carry his child. After reading this, Honoria began to smile bitterly as she quickly flipped the page, looking for another entry to read. The more she read, the more she had come to regret her actions that had led to her current predicament. As such, she read the next entry with tears in her eyes as she struggled to prevent them from dropping onto the diary and staining the page and its contents. November 23, 1418. Today is my birthday, and I celebrated it alone. I don't know why I did not tell anyone about it. Maybe because I feared that such information could lead to Berengar figuring out my identity. If he learned that I am the princess of the Byzantine Empire, would he send me home? I don't know if I would be able to live without the support he has given me. To go back home and marry that gay prince, I think I would rather die. Honoria quickly flipped the page after reading that. She was delighted that she was still in Kufstein, despite everything that had happened. As such, there was no point dwelling on the past. The following few pages contained nothing of significance, and as such, the girl flipped to another entry of interest. December 25, 1418. Today is Christmas. A few days ago was Berengar's birthday, and though there was a large celebration, nothing of interest happened. Even though the house comprises nothing more than Berengar, Henrietta, Lind, Hans, and myself, I had a wonderful time. I even managed to spend some alone time with Berengar. It seems that the days where he interacts with me are starting to become less frequent. I think he is trying to distance himself from me, but I don't know why. What have I done to upset him to such a degree? For this new year, I will give even more effort to gain his affection. After reading this, Honoria began to skip a lot of entries before landing upon one filled with tears and ink smudges. She was pretty emotional when she wrote this. As such, she took a deep breath before reading the contents, fully aware of what it contained. February 2, 1419. I had a massive fight with Berengar today. I don't even know why we were arguing. He has been so distant lately that it is breaking my heart. I tried to tell him how I felt, but it just came out wrong. I ended up saying some profoundly personal and hurtful things. At the end of it, he simply glared at me with eyes of fury that I did not know he possessed. Afterward, he sent me to my room to think over my actions. Where did it all go wrong? Is this my fault for not being honest with him? After reading this, Honoria sighed and skipped through multiple entries. The relationship between her and Berengar only seemed to get worse as she flipped through the pages until she landed on yet another tear-stained entry. June 6, 1419. Berengar has cancelled our trip to Istria, and by cancelled, I mean he has chosen not to go with me. Instead, he is tasking my protection to his guards. It seems he wants little to do with me at the moment. I don't know what is causing this rift, but I suspect it is my fault. I need some fresh air and a new perspective. Being cooped up in Kufstein all this time is starting to get to my head. This trip will be good for me. Even if Berengar is not coming, it should give me some time to think about everything that has gone wrong this past year. After reading this, Honoria smiled for a moment, reflecting on the beautiful memories she made on the journey she had taken. She flipped the page and found her smile continuing to grow as she wrote about her trip abroad. July 27, 1419. It has been almost a month since I last saw Berengar, and I have made it to the shores of Aragon. The freedom of the sea and the experience I have gained by interacting with various cultures have given me time to understand myself and why my relationship with Berengar is so toxic. Berengar doesn't trust me. I have been lying about my identity for some time, and he knows. There is no other explanation. However, this is not his fault, it is mine, and mine alone. My insecurities, jealousy, and lies are what have created this rift between us. I do not doubt that Berengar's child with Lind is already born, and he is probably delighted right now. It would be rude of me to barge in at such a time of happiness. So I have decided to write him a few letters, informing him of my journey and progress. Even though I know the guards he has tasked to protect me have been already notifying him, I feel it would be best if he heard from me directly. What we need now is space, so I will continue to write to him, and I will stay on my journey across the Mediterranean until I am ready to tell him the truth. Who knows what I might find? The following entry that Honoria flipped to was stained with her blood. After reading through it, a smile formed on her face, and she reflected upon that fateful day that had filled her with dreams and determination. September 3, 1419. Pirates have attacked my ship. Luckily, the guards assigned to me could defend our vessel. So much so that we managed to board the pirates' ship and wipe them out. I was forced to take up arms during the conflict and have sustained minor injuries. I have never felt so alive before. We plundered the pirates' cargo and stole the caravel they used. It is mine now. I have my own ship. Maybe I will form a crew of my own and sail across the sea, targeting pirates and brigands for their ill-gotten gains. I must thank Berengar for all the training he provided to me. I likely would have died in the conflict if not for him. I think I am ready to return home. Home? Is Kufstein my home now? I don't even know the answer to that anymore. All I understand is that I have matured on this journey and now know what I want in this life. After reading this, Honoria turned the page. This entry was blank. She had not journaled since the moment she decided to return home. Now that she was in Kufstein, she felt it was the perfect time to get her thoughts into place. As such, she dipped her quill into ink before writing the newest passage to her diary. September 15, 1419. Over a year has passed since I first arrived in Kufstein. I can honestly say that even though there were times where I was miserable, it was a far better experience than being locked up in Constantinople. I did not have the chance to meet with Berengar long enough to express my thoughts to him upon my return. However, he seemed to be generally happy that I was back. Considering we left on such bad terms, I was slightly afraid he would still be mad at me. A little break is all that we needed, and some time to clear our heads. However, I am ready now. I will tell him everything there is to know about me tomorrow. I will be frank about who I am, where I come from, what I have become under his tutelage, and what it is I desire in life. To be honest, I am quite frightened, but I will no longer live in fear of rejection. If Berengar accepts me, it will be for who I am. I am no longer that scared little princess locked away in her father's palace. I am a sailor, an adventurer, and if Berengar thinks he can keep me locked up in his castle, like an obedient little princess, he is dead wrong. The worst thing that could happen is Berengar rejects me. If he does, I will pay him back for his kindness with the wealth I have gained from the pirates and set sail for unknown destinations. I have no idea what crew I will form or how I will go about it, yet I know in my heart that adventure and glory wait for me. After writing this, Honoria allowed the ink to settle before closing the diary and locking it shut. After doing so, she placed it within her underwear drawer and lay down on her bed. She would need a good night's rest if she were to talk with Berengar tomorrow about everything she had come to realize over these past few months. Chapter 268 Honoria's Confession. Berengar was within his study. It had been a year since Adela's birthday, and he had made significant progress in this time. At the moment, he was drafting a new form of naval law, one that would prove vital to the upcoming war with the Venetians. There was no doubt about it. Relations with the Republic of Venice had deteriorated to the point where war was inevitable, and frankly, Berengar did not have enough ships built yet to combat the threat of the Venetian navy. Thus, he had a peculiar idea from his previous life in mind to combat the Venetian menace. As he drafted this legislation, he began to think about a particular candidate on his mind to fulfill the role. A bitter smile formed on his face as he reflected on his poor relationship with Honoria. The past year his relationship with the girl had been strained. A year ago, she claimed she would tell him her identity, but the day never came, and the more he waited for the girl to be honest with him, the more his patience wore thin. If not for the trip Honoria had taken, Berengar probably would have done something reckless. However, when she returned after several months of absence, he felt as if the thing that had been missing from his life was finally fulfilled. He knew now that he had feelings for the girl, even if their relationship was by no means healthy. He just wished the girl would reveal what he had long since found out about her. Though it was difficult, Berengar used his spies to procure the intel that the princess had run away and was presumed dead. Throughout the past year, Berengar's spies worked hard to track Honoria's previous journey through the Black Sea and the Danube to Kufstein. Despite knowing the truth, Berengar had still waited for the young princess to reveal her past on her own terms. The constant lies and the insecure jealousy she had shown when Berengar was with other women were part of why they had drifted so far apart. As Berengar thought about this, he drank from his skull chalice. Shortly after taking a sip of the fortified wine, he heard a knock on his door, and as such, he got up and opened it to find Honoria standing in his doorway with a flustered expression. Before Berengar could say a word, she grabbed a hold of him and kissed him on the lips passionately. Though startled, Berengar accepted the gift and instead took charge as he showed the inexperienced princess how the art of kissing was done correctly. After a few moments of intimacy, Honoria broke apart from Berengar. She was fully blushing at this point and muttered beneath her breath in embarrassment, "I love you." Though Berengar wanted to tease the girl, he decided not to and instead led her into his study, where the two sat down across from each other. He could tell that this was a much-needed conversation and decided to be serious about it. Berengar poured Honoria a glass filled with the fortified wine and handed it to her before sipping on his own. The two of them drank in silence for some time before Berengar broke it. "I suppose you have something you want to say?" To this, Honoria responded. She took a deep breath before uttering the first thought on her mind. "I haven't been entirely honest with you. My name is not Valeria, it is Honoria, and I am the princess of the Byzantine Empire." After saying this, Berengar merely stared at her with a stoic expression, which got on the princess's nerves. She began to pout. Honoria had expected that Berengar would have a far greater reaction to such news. However, the way he was looking at her as if he did not care in the slightest irritated her, thus she began to voice her frustrations. "Well, what do you think?" Berengar placed his skull chalice on the table before revealing his thoughts to the young princess. "I know, in fact, I have known for quite some time. If I am being honest, I have been waiting for you to tell me, but you just never did, even after promising you would do so. I suppose that is one of the reasons why I grew so distant to you. I don't like being lied to by a girl I happen to fancy." Honoria was slightly shocked, though she had suspected Berengar knew the truth about her identity on more than one occasion. She had always rejected such notions. Instead, she always thought that he was angry about her for lying about other things. After calming herself down by drinking more of the wine, she eventually began to speak her piece. "I have feelings for you, Berengar, even if we did not start on the right foot. However, I won't lie to you, I don't intend to stay trapped in Kufstein Castle for the rest of my life. I want to go out and explore the world and go on adventures. You asked me a year ago what my dreams were, and I have come to realize it. When I was gone, my ship was targeted by pirates. Due to your guard's assistance, we were able to repel them and even seize their assets. It was truly exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. I want a ship and crew of my own. I want to sail the sea and plunder the vessels of those who deserve it. However, I also want a safe place to call home, and a man to hold me and comfort me after I come back from a long journey at sea. I want that man to be you, but if you are intent on keeping me locked up as you plan for Lind and Adela, I can't see myself agreeing to that." Hearing this, Berengar's lips curled into a smirk. The look on his face greatly dissatisfied Honoria, that is until the reason for it was revealed. Berengar handed the piece of paper he had been working on earlier in the day to Honoria while remaining completely silent. When Honoria gazed at the document in her hands, she was baffled. "What is this?" Berengar leaned back in his seat before explaining the details to the young princess. "It is a letter of marque and reprisal. Essentially, I am looking for experienced sailors to attack and capture the vessels of the nations that I am at war with. You may not be aware of this, but conflict is brewing with the Venetians, and it won't be long before a fight breaks out. I am not ready for this war. They have hundreds of vessels and are cranking out their caravels at a much faster rate than I can construct my frigates. So I need people like you, sailors who seek adventure and glory to work for me, and take care of my enemy, whether that be their naval or merchant fleets. It sounds to me like the perfect job for you, do you agree?" Upon hearing this, Honoria looked at Berengar with a gaze filled with affection and confusion. As such, she wanted to clarify what Berengar had just said. "You want me to be a pirate?" Berengar shook his head and corrected her instantly. To him, there was a distinction between a common pirate and what he was asking her to become. Privateer, essentially it is the same thing, but you have the protection of the ducal crown of Austria. You will fly my flag on your vessel and have the full legal authority to attack my enemies. However, you are forbidden from attacking neutral parties. If you do so, you will be branded a pirate and suffer the same fate. Honoria was shocked when she heard this. Such an idea did not exist until now, yet Berengar had essentially legalized piracy, at least to the extent of attacking his enemies. Which was more than enough to earn a fortune. If a war broke out with the Venetians, one could become exceptionally wealthy by attacking their shipping vessels. However, what Berengar said next shocked her even more. "As for a ship, I wanted it to be a secret, but I have begun the construction of a sloop of war for you as a birthday gift. I know it is still a few months away, but I assure you this 18-gun vessel is far superior to that silly caravel you have captured from those pirates." Honoria gazed at Berengar with further astonishment. She instantly wanted to clarify the issue at hand. "You know about my caravel?" To this, Berengar simply smirked as he responded in a haughty tone. "Of course. Remember, my guards watched you the entire time. nothing on your journey happened that I don't know about. I protect my women, and I can't protect them if I don't know what trouble they might be in. As you can see, I am very supportive of your dreams. You can come and go from Kufstein as you please, and I will be here for you when you desire to see me. However, I have two conditions for all of this. The last part of Berengar's statement invoked Honoria's natural curiosity. As such, she asked the question on her mind. And that is? Berengar began to sip from his chalice, finishing the fortified wine in the process. After wiping his mouth with a napkin, he informed Honoria of his condition. As you are probably aware, I am a very jealous lover. As long as you promise to stay loyal to me, I will be more than happy to give you everything you desire. Of course, I would prefer if your crew was entirely comprised of women. I would not be able to sleep at night worrying about your safety surrounded by a bunch of scoundrels. As long as you agree to these terms, I will be more than happy to fund your adventures and give you all the support you need to achieve your dreams. So how about it? Do you swear to be loyal to me as my woman and take up a crew of only women? Upon hearing this, Honoria began to giggle. After a while, she sighed heavily before calming herself down. You are such a hypocrite? To this, Berengar merely smiled before expressing his views. Aren't we all? Honoria smiled and walked around Berengar's desk before sitting on his lap and kissing him passionately once more. After releasing herself from his grasp, she nodded her head and spoke her mind. Consider this my promise to you. Afterward, she began to strip Berengar's clothes while he removed her own. Before long, the two were enjoying the warmth of each other's bodies. As Berengar took Honoria's virginity, he gazed down at sight with a smile on his face before speaking his thoughts. It is good to be the Duke. Chapter 269 Plans for Independence. After spending the night with Honoria, much to the ire of Lind, Berengar had successfully cemented his relationship with the young princess of the Byzantine Empire. As for his plans for her identity as a privateer, he decided it would be best for her to keep up the ruse of Valeria Zoanara. Berengar had even helped her create a convincing persona that others would not look into. The days of Lady Valeria of Antioch were long gone. Now Honoria pretended to be Valeria Zoanara, an orphan from Constantinople who grew up as a captive of pirates. For the next few days, Berengar had spent much time with Honoria. Now that they were a couple, he wanted to show her some love. As such, he spent a great deal of time with the girl, going on dates, and taking her to bed. After a few days, Berengar got back to work. He had more important things to worry about. Thus, while Berengar was working on expanding his navy to compete with the arms race that had appeared with the Venetians, Honoria was set to task recruiting an all-female crew. She had decided to promise wealth and glory to young women and girls who were down on their luck, orphans, prostitutes, bar wenches, any number of ordinary women who dreamed of a better life than what they currently had. As for Berengar, he was currently sitting in his study once more, while Lind was sitting in front of him with a scowl on her face. She was well aware of what Berengar and Honoria had gotten up to in the past few days, and she was displeased. Until now, she had Berengar entirely to herself, and though she knew eventually Berengar would marry Adela and sleep with her, she wanted to hold on to the fact that she was Berengar's only partner for a bit longer. Seeing that his lover was upset over the lack of attention he had given her over the past few days, Berengar began to tease the young woman. You know, dear, you could always join us. Nobody is preventing you from climbing into bed with Honoria and myself. By now, Lind thought there was no shameless thing Berengar could say that would make her embarrassed. However, when she thought of such a scenario, her mind went blank, and her porcelain cheeks began to flush red with embarrassment. Seeing Lind was pondering the decision, Berengar merely chuckled before shifting the topic. Eventually, she would come around to the idea. Out of all of the girls Berengar had by his side, Lind was by far the most open to new ideas. Even though he had not spent any intimate time with Adela and had just recently gotten to know Honoria in such a sense, he knew enough about their personalities that Lind would be the easiest to coax into group sex. For now, he placed the document in front of Lind and smiled devilishly. Your sister Adelheid has proven exceptional in counterintelligence. The Emperor's agents have attempted to infiltrate Innsbruck and sabotage the factories. Luckily she caught them before they could do any damage, and they have been interrogated extensively, confessing to their crimes. I will have them publicly speak of their crimes and pin the blame onto the Emperor and thus erode the confidence his vassals have in him. If he is willing to sabotage my factories out of fear of my rapid growth, then it has become apparent that the Emperor is my enemy. A war for independence is inevitable, and I need to know that our agents are up to the task. Lind looked at the report. Briefly, she was already aware of the issue as the Director of Intelligence and thus gave an honest situation report. The Department of Intelligence has extended into northern Italy, including Florence, where the Emperor resides. We can easily strike at him within his home territory. The real question is whether our armies are ready for war. I know you have 50,000 soldiers at the moment, nearly half a dozen vessels, and enough sailors and marines to arm them. But a war for independence against the Holy Roman Empire would drag the Italians and the Swiss into the conflict. We have no allies. What exactly is the time frame for this war of yours? To this, Berengar rose from his seat and walked over to the window, where he looked out upon the city he had created. After gazing into the distance for a few moments, he made his stance clear. It is not as simple as you make it seem. When the war in Bohemia ends, the entire Catholic world will shift its attention onto us regardless of who wins. When they do so, we will be beset by all sides by enemies, and few allies to call upon. To ensure our victory in the upcoming crusade, my plan is twofold. First and foremost, we can take a preemptive strike against the Italians, and by extension, the Swiss. We can wage war for independence against the Holy Roman Empire, where we will destroy the Venetian and Genoan navies while crushing the Italian and Swiss armies in battle. If they are weakened before the crusade is declared, we will have dealt with our two closest adversaries and have given ourselves a fighting chance. After hearing this, Lind straightened her back and put down her wine cup. She provided her earnest attention to Berengar before asking the question on her mind. What is the second part? Berengar sighed as he heard this and pressed his forehead into his palm. Seeing that her lover was visibly stressed, Lind rose from her seat and approached Berengar's back, where she began to rub his shoulders. While she was doing so, Berengar stated the second part of his plan. As for the second portion, I will not lie, it is going to be difficult, as you know I am far from a skilled diplomat, and this plan requires effective diplomacy. Essentially, we would need to secure alliances with the enemies of my enemies. In particular, I have my eyes on Iberia. Despite the ongoing Reconquista, the Catholic Iberians are a fiercely zealous people and would indeed send an army into Austria. To ensure that they are preoccupied, I will have to travel to Granada and gain the support of the Moors who live there. This has its downsides, as such an action will only further justify the activities of the Vatican when they declare a crusade against me, at least in the minds of the Catholics. Openly supporting the Moors against Reconquista will indeed invoke the ire of the Iberians. However, the benefits of this action are not just a matter of keeping the Catholic Iberians occupied. Building an alliance with the Emirate of Granada, who is inhabiting the Strait of Gibraltar, is crucial to my plans, as I will have a friendly nation in charge of the access to the Atlantic. When Lind heard this, she was confused. She had no idea why Berengar would care about access to the Atlantic, but she did not pay more than a second's worth of attention to such a thing. Instead, she nodded her head in agreement. What Berengar said had made sense to her. Berengar was always a big-picture kind of man. He constantly plotted 10 steps ahead of himself. While Lind was thinking of the short-term consequences of a war with the Emperor, Berengar was already planning for the upcoming crusade, which they both knew loomed over Austria and southern Germany as a whole. Lind ceased rubbing Berengar's back as he turned around and faced her, cupping her beautiful face in his hands as he soothed her worries. You asked me what the time frame for my war for independence is? Within a year, I intend to have a navy large enough to contend with Italy. By then, my army will have grown significantly more, and I will not have to fear the combined might of the Swiss and Italian forces. After we have crushed the Emperor and his allies, I will declare myself King of Austria, and in doing so, secure my independence. When that is over, I can hold my head high as I marry you, 3 girls, knowing that I am the sovereign of my realm. Hearing Berengar speak of his grand ambitions always made Lind excited. Few men would have the courage to stare down the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in a war of intrigue, while preparing for a full-scale military conflict. Such boldness was attractive to Lind and affirmed her choice of partner. Even if she had to share Berengar with others, she did not mind. After all, Lind was convinced that one day Berengar would become a figure remembered for all of history. In her eyes, it was better to be one of several wives that belonged to an extraordinary man than the single wife of a great man. With that said, Berengar had much to plan for and little time to do it. As such, he dismissed Lind before getting back to work. He would have his fun with her later in the night. As for Honoria, she was free to join the fun, though whether she would do so was another story. Chapter 270 Preparing for a Journey. The Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Europe, in Berengar's past life, fell to the Spanish in 1492. With the fall of Granada and having gained access to the Strait of Gibraltar, the Spanish hired explorers to set sail for parts unknown. The results of this were the fact that a man named Christopher Columbus rediscovered the Americas after such knowledge was lost following Leif Erikson's expedition to Vinland. This discovery resulted in the expansion of European power and plenty of previously unknown resources finding their way into Europe. However, in this timeline, the year is currently 1419, and the Emirate of Granada is still standing. Compared to its Catholic neighbors, it has been dramatically weakened from centuries of warfare. Despite this, things were about to change for the tiny Muslim kingdom on the southern edge of Iberia. Berengar had great plans in place for Granada. To put it simply, the mighty Duke of Austria needed allies, and to him, the enemy of his enemy was his friend. Considering how zealous the Iberian Catholics were, it only made sense to make use of their longest-lasting enemy. As such, Berengar had prepared a trade envoy with his new merchant fleets over the past few months, making waves within the emirate. His intent was simple: establish diplomatic ties to the Emirate of Granada and arm them with sufficient weaponry. The purpose was to distract the Iberian Catholics when the time came for the crusade against the German Reformation. After months of working hard to get the attention of the Granada royal family, Berengar had finally caught their interest. At the moment, Berengar was seated on his ducal throne, where he read the letter in his hands. This letter was from Sultan Hassan al-Fadl, the current Sultan of the Emirate of Granada. This document addressed the desire to meet with Berengar in person, and upon reading its contents, a delighted smile formed on Berengar's lips. After months of hard work, he had finally gotten the invitation that he craved. As such, he was eager to set sail as quickly as possible. Due to the diplomatic nature of the visit, Berengar would not be taking one of his frigates on his journey to the Emirate of Granada. Instead, he would employ one of the many full-masted clippers he had designed for his merchant fleet. Such a ship was faster than any warship and would allow Berengar to safely reach the Iberian coastline even if he were pursued by hostile vessels. After reading the letter, Berengar raised from his seat. He knew his faults in regards to diplomacy. He was an incredibly prideful man who did not tolerate ultimatums or threats. To such things his usual response was violence. Due to his lack of ability in regards to diplomacy, he desired to bring someone along with him who could effectively nullify his naturally brazen attitude. From what he knew, there was only one person he trusted to convey his best intent calmly and effectively. As such, he headed to his study, where he took out a piece of parchment and wrote a letter to a 15-year-old girl whom he had been neglecting for far too long. The letter was addressed to Adela, and for the first time, Berengar planned to use her natural talents. As such, he sent the letter to his young fiancée informing her of the desire to take her with him to the Emirate of Granada to aid him in his diplomatic efforts. It was also an excuse to spend some time with the woman who would become first among his wives. He quickly sent a letter explaining his circumstances and the desire to meet with her in Trieste, where he planned to sail with her to Granada. After doing so, he immediately began to prepare for his excursion. The first matter of business was informing his two lovers of his departure. As such, he quickly left to find them. After searching around the castle for some time, Berengar found Honoria and Lind in his newborn daughter's room. The two young women were playing with Hans and his little sister, who Lind had given birth to a couple of months prior. The little girl had a similar appearance to Hans, insofar that she had pale skin, strawberry blonde hair, and sapphire eyes. The infant child was no older than 2 months and was being exceptionally doted upon by both Lind and Honoria. As for Hans, he had begun to act up because he was not getting the attention from his mother that he had previously acquired. Hans had grown not only in body but in mind throughout this past year. He was over 2 years old now, and he was already beginning to read and write. He could speak in simple sentences and had displayed exceptional intelligence. So much so that Berengar was beginning to question whether or not the boy was reincarnated like himself. However, he highly doubted such a thing for one simple reason. Despite the boy's high intelligence, he still behaved like a small child. He showed no sign of maturity and wisdom that a child with the memories of a past life would typically have. So unless this kid was the reincarnation of an evil mastermind who decided to behave like a small child to blend in, then the likelihood of him being a transmigrator was slim. Still ever being the cautious man, Berengar kept a close eye on Hans and his behavior while he was able to do so. After standing in the doorway for a few moments in silence, his two beautiful lovers finally noticed Berengar's presence and beckoned him over to their side. However, the young duke merely shook his head before responding with his intentions. "I will be journeying to the Emirate of Granada for a diplomatic visit. I will be gone for some time, I just wanted to let you know." Quote. Lind nodded her head as she heard this. She was aware of Berengar's plan to ally with Granada and was well prepared for his leave of absence. Honoria, on the other hand, stood up from her spot with sparkling eyes. "When do we set sail?" She had assumed that she would be tagging along, considering that she was an experienced sailor by now. However, Berengar merely shook his head before responding to Honoria's comments. "I am not taking you with me. Though you have begun to improve your acting skills, it is far too risky for you to follow me to Granada. If the Sultan were to find out about your identity, it could cause problems. For now, you should focus on finding your crew members. I promise I won't be gone for long." Upon hearing this, Honoria began to pout in silence. She felt that Berengar was leaving too soon after mending the rift between them, especially after they had finally become an official couple. Nevertheless, she felt pleased knowing that no other woman would be accompanying him, utterly unaware that Berengar intended to drag Adela along with him. After informing the two young women about his plans, Lind was the one to bring up a critical point of contention. "So if you are leaving tomorrow, then who will you spend your last night with before your trip?" Honoria was also curious about this, and both of the girls gazed at Berengar with pleading glances. Upon seeing this, Berengar began to chuckle as he approached the two women and grabbed a hold of them each with one arm before dragging them into his embrace, where he made sure to grab a hold of their bountiful breasts. "Is it too much to ask for both?" Lind began to blush and cast her glance to the side as she heard this. As for Honoria, she shoved Berengar away and crossed her arms before pouting. It would appear the girl would need more convincing before Berengar could coax her into a threesome. When faced with such difficulties, Berengar gave his decree. "I guess I will have to go with Lind then. Sweetheart, put the kids to bed, and then we can go have our fun." After saying this, Lind began to do as instructed, and Honoria scurried off in disgust. She was leaving Berengar and Lind behind with their two kids. As Berengar watched Honoria's fine behind pass through the door, he called out to her. "You know where to find us if you change your mind." However, Honoria said nothing in response to this and rushed towards her quarters. As for Berengar and Lind, they put their kids to bed before absconding to the bedroom, where the couple had their usual fun. The next day, Berengar would travel to Istria to meet with Adela and set sail towards the Iberian coast. He had plenty of work cut out for him if he wanted to succeed in establishing an alliance with the Sultan. One thing was sure, he could finally spend some quality time with his future wife. He was ashamed that he could not spend as much time with Adela when compared to the degree he spent with his lovers. Thus he looked forward to the upcoming diplomatic visit to the Emirate of Granada and hoped that Adela would too. Chapter 271 Arriving in Granada. The clear blue skies shone above the province of Istria. Within the city of Trieste, Berengar stood at the port. In front of him was a large three-masted clipper. This ship was a transport vessel Berengar used to sell his wares across the Mediterranean over the last couple of months. Though Berengar intended to create a massive royal clipper for his family's travel in the near future, it was secondary to the concerns of establishing a naval armada and a large trade fleet. All he could do for now was to use one of his standard trading vessels that had been completed as his means of transport. Despite the fact that Berengar was inching ever closer to his dreams to discover the new world in this timeline, it would still be a few months before he was fully prepared for such a venture. Thus, Berengar intended to construct a large and powerful fleet before he ventured westward into unknown parts. At the moment, Berengar was working towards his other goal of independence by establishing an alliance with the Emirate of Granada. Not only were the Moors who inhabited the region instrumental in distracting Iberian Catholics from joining in on the upcoming crusade against Berengar and his duchy, but by providing them with sufficient arms to protect themselves against their Catholic neighbors, Berengar could delay the Reconquista. With this, Berengar could prevent Spain and Portugal from becoming significant rivals in the colonization of the New World. After gazing upon the mighty vessel with a sense of admiration, Berengar felt a pair of dainty arms wrap around him. These, of course, belonged to his future bride Adela. The young girl had grown immensely in the past few years since Berengar first arrived in this world. Though she was not as busty as Honoria or Lind, she had developed into a stunning young woman. Adela had a solid B-cup-sized chest and a petite stature. She was slim, and in a way, Berengar found this quite appealing. If one were to have a harem of women, it would be ideal to have some variety. Adela was dressed in a sapphire blue dress with golden accents. The jewelry she wore was a mix of fine gold and sapphires, which highlighted her matching eyes perfectly. She still wore her twin-tail hairstyle, and Berengar found this to be quite adorable. After taking in the breathtaking image of his young fiancée, Berengar smiled before greeting the young woman. "You have truly become a gorgeous young woman, Adela. I can hardly wait until the day we are married." Throughout these past few years, Adela had worked hard to become someone who could aid Berengar in his work as a head of state. Thus she had become quite efficient in diplomacy and administration. Berengar was aware of her growth in these aspects and had personally requested her for this diplomatic visit to Granada. When Adela heard Berengar's kind words, she bowed respectfully before responding with a formal greeting. After all, they were still in public, and thus she felt it inappropriate to refer to Berengar by his first name. "You honor me, Your Grace." After their initial greeting was over, Berengar grabbed a hold of Adela and hugged her. He did not care for formal etiquette, especially when it was with one of the girls he loved. Adela, on the other hand, began to flush red with embarrassment, but she did not pull herself out of Berengar's grasp. After all, she craved his attention, and now she was finally receiving it without any form of interference. After holding onto Adela for some time, Berengar whispered in her ear. "It's been too long." The couple shared the intimate moment for a few moments before Berengar finally broke away and got down to business. "Well, are you ready to depart?" To this, Adela nodded her head silently before her servants began to carry her luggage onto the vessel. Berengar walked alongside Adela while holding her little hand in his own as they stepped onto the ship that would transport them to Granada. After stepping onto the vessel, Berengar led Adela below deck where her quarters were awaiting her. While the two of them were on board the ship, the captain's quarters were allotted to Berengar, and the first mate's cabin was given to Adela. These cabins were large enough to host a queen-sized bed within them. As for the ship's captain, he stayed in one of the other cabins, and so too did his officers. After settling in, the boat began to depart. Berengar stayed within the saloon alongside Adela for the time being, where they continued to catch up on the events since their last meeting, which was not long ago on her 15th birthday. Days would pass before they finally arrived in Granada. Due to the unrivaled speed of the clippers, the journey from Istria to Iberia was substantially shorter than if they took one of the more contemporary vessels like the Carrack or Caravel. When the three-masted clipper finally docked at the port city of Motril, they did not stay long. Instead, they immediately got into a caravan and rode up to the capital city of Granada, where the Sultan and his family resided. After several days of travel, Berengar and his host arrived at the Granadan royal court, where the Sultan welcomed him with open arms. The man was even younger than Berengar. From his appearance, he was no older than 19. Hassan had recently inherited his position from his late father. He had a handsome clean-shaven face with lightly tanned skin and shoulder-length dark hair. The young man also had eyes the color of chocolate. As the Sultan of Granada, Hassan was an ethnic Berber. Medieval Europeans used the term Moor to describe a group of people from North Africa mainly comprised of a mix of Arabs and Berbers, and to a limited extent, their sub-Saharan African slaves and mercenaries that were primarily taken from the areas that would be known in Berengar's previous life as Mali and Niger. Upon seeing the extravagantly dressed Duke of Austria enter through his palace gates, the man who ruled over the Emirate of Granada greeted Berengar in a traditional Islamic fashion. As Salam alaikum, O great Duke of Austria. Though the man spoke in Arabic, Berengar had a translator nearby. However, much to the surprise of everyone present, Berengar returned his greeting with an appropriate response. Wa alaikum salam, mighty Sultan of Granada. Due to Berengar's tenure in Afghanistan, he knew a bit of the Arabic tongue. Despite the fact that Arabic was a minority language in Afghanistan, Berengar had spent many of his years there learning the language. The reason was that it was a more common tongue throughout the world than Pashtun or Dari, and thus after his service, he could potentially bring it into his professional life. Though it was a far more modern variant than the version spoken in medieval Iberia, he could still vaguely get his words across. Adela was also surprised that Berengar seemed to know how to speak Arabic, at least to some degree, and gazed curiously at her fiancé as he addressed the Sultan as if he were a long-lost friend. When I received your invitation to visit your royal palace, I was quite excited. I think there is much our two peoples can accomplish if we work together. Upon hearing this, Hassan began to chuckle and nodded his head. I look forward to discussing our people's future together. Tell me, who is this beautiful young woman next to you? Berengar grabbed a hold of Adela's shoulder in response to the Sultan's words and dragged her in close to him before declaring her position in his life. This is Adela von Gratz, daughter of Marquis Otto von Gratz and my fiancé. We will be married next year. The Sultan nodded his head as he heard this before responding to Berengar's claims. You are truly a lucky man, Duke Berengar. I also have a beautiful bride. It would appear that we have more in common than I initially thought. After saying this, the Sultan personally led Berengar, Adela, and their host into his palace, introducing the magnificent structures and grandiose furnishings along the way. After a while, they stopped at the dining hall, where a meal was being prepared. Come, sit, enjoy dinner with my family and me. You must be starving after such a long journey. Upon hearing this, Berengar did not refuse, and as such, he nodded politely before pulling out Adela's seat, allowing her to sit down at the table gracefully, where he then sat next to her. Before long, Berengar and his host as well as the royal family of Granada had gathered in the dining hall to share a meal. This would be the first of many discussions that would occur during Berengar's visit to Granda. With Adela by his side, Berengar was confident in coming to an agreement that would be beneficial to both himself and the Emirate of Granada. Though whether such an alliance would occur was yet to be seen. Chapter 272 Negotiations with the Sultan of Granada. Berengar and Adela sat at the Sultan of Granada's table, enjoying food that was unique to the culture. Berengar had never tasted such delicacies before, and as an avid foodie, he was enjoying it to his heart's content. On the other hand, Adela was slightly worried at the gazes she was receiving from some of the more traditional members of Hassan's dynasty. The unwelcome looks afforded to her resulted from Berengar's refusal to force his young fiancé to wear a hijab. It was a matter of principle to him. Hassan was far more secular than many of the people in Granada, and because of this, he had allowed Adela to walk around freely in his territory without some form of face covering. In his eyes, she was a Christian woman and a diplomat, and it would be rude of him to force such traditions on foreigners like the Austrian host. This lack of devotion to the traditions and the Islamic faith was a point of contention among many other members of Hassan's dynasty, and they had begun to plot in the shadows against the young sultan. Though alcohol was not served at the feast, Berengar enjoyed himself nonetheless. He took a break from the roasted lamb to discuss matters of importance between himself and Hassan. After all, a banquet was an excellent opportunity to discuss business. Tell me, Your Majesty, what is the current situation like with your neighbors? I have heard that the Iberian Catholics are attempting to conquer Granada. All I hear is Catholic propaganda about how it is a matter of time before Granada is reclaimed for Christendom, so I would like to hear your opinion about the ongoing war efforts. While Berengar spoke in German, his words were translated to Hassan by a translator hired by the royal court of Granda for this special occasion. Likewise, Berengar himself had a translator to convert the Arabic words of the Sultan into German so that he could adequately understand them. The differences between modern Arabic and medieval Arabic were too significant for Berengar to overcome. After all, he was not even fluent in the modern dialect. Thus, the conversation between the two men was carried on by the duo of translators that both parties had hired. Hassan was willing to meet with Berengar because he was aware of the German Reformation that Berengar had spurred and that he was enemies with the Catholic faith. In a way, they held similar positions. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, relying on their means to defend their territory, they would be natural allies if they weren't so far apart. However, Hassan was not willing to reveal the complete difficulty he was facing against the Catholics of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal. The reasons for this were relatively simple. For starters, he was currently negotiating an agreement with Berengar. The benefits he could obtain were purely based upon the show of force he could provide. In reality, his position was relatively poor, barely holding onto the territory he currently had. However, he would never reveal this, and as such, the young sultan proudly declared his army's capability. Despite being surrounded by enemies on all sides, we are holding out well enough. This is a war against our faith, and the soldiers of Granada will never fall so long as they have faith in Allah. Berengar nodded when he heard this. He knew that the Sultan would never accept Christian soldiers on his land as military aid. However, Berengar did not plan to do such a thing, as it would be an open declaration of war against the Catholic world. Instead, he touched upon the weakness of Granada that he knew they were facing. That is good to hear. I would be beside myself if your mighty kingdom fell against those self-righteous Catholics. Tell me, how are your logistics? Are you able to properly supply your soldiers with food, water, and arms? If not, I would be more than happy to provide material support for your cause. When the members of Hassan's dynasty heard this, they were surprised. Berengar may not be a Catholic, but he was still Christian. The idea of a Christian ruler aiding the Muslim kingdom against other Christians was practically unheard of, at least when it came to European affairs. The Sultan began to discuss among his advisors such a possibility before asking for clarification. After several moments of discussion where Berengar and Adela were merely eating their meal in peace, Hassan began to ask some of the questions on his mind. You would provide us material aid? In what way? A smirk began to curve itself upon Berengar's lips when he heard this. The Sultan had taken the bait, and as such, he could start to negotiate on his terms. I can provide arms, armor, and even food. You will not need to worry about supplies taking months to arrive. My transport ships are the fastest in the world and can sail from Trieste to Motril within a matter of days. The Granadan host was shocked to hear this. Such speeds were unheard of in this period, yet it was confirmed that they had arrived in Granada relatively quickly. As such, the Sultan contemplated upon this for a few moments before asking another one of his questions. When you say arms, what exactly would you be willing to provide us with? Berengar drank from the chalice that was filled with water, quenching his parched throat and washing down the roasted lamb before responding to this particular question. His answer, if agreed upon, would change the balance of power within Iberia. After taking his sweet time to respond, Berengar wiped his mouth with the napkin before doing so. I can provide you with pikes and arquebus firearms for your infantry. In terms of artillery, I can assist you with falconet cannons. These are weapons of my invention that fire a 1-pound cannonball. Despite its small size, it can bring down a castle wall far quicker than traditional siege methods if used in large numbers or repeated barrages. If necessary, I can even send some of my officers to advise you on the tactics and strategies needed to wield such weapons properly. While the two men were conversing their negotiations, Adela was observing. She watched the reactions of the other members of the Sultan's dynasty. Though it went unnoticed by both Berengar and Hassan, the worried expressions on their faces did not get by Adela's sharp gaze. She could instantly tell that something was going on behind the scenes of the Sultan's family, and whatever it could be, it did not bode well for Berengar and his plans. As such, she decided she would properly inform Berengar of these issues when they were alone. Ultimately, the Sultan decided to halt the negotiations. For now, such a substantial promise of support would have to be thoroughly considered. After all, the man was sharp and was not desperate enough to accept such lofty conditions without thinking it through. Thus he announced his decision while maintaining the dignity of a sultan. Your words intrigue me, but I will need some time to consider your offer. In the meantime, feel free to treat my home as if it were your own. I look forward to our further discussions on this matter. Berengar smiled and nodded before taking a drink from his chalice. He knew he would not reach an agreement at the first discussion. Thus he was well prepared for this. The shifty gazes of Hassan's family did not go unnoticed by Berengar. However, he assumed they were simply nervous about dealing with an infidel, and thus he let it pass for now. After finishing the meal, Berengar, Adela, and their host were led to the quarters allotted to them during their stay. Upon entering his room and lying down on the bed, Berengar heard a knock on his door. He quickly got up from his short rest before opening it, where he noticed Adela standing with a worried expression. Can I come in? Berengar thought about it for a moment before silently nodding his head and allowing the girl entry to his room. After doing so, he shut the door and sat down on his bed, where he beckoned his future wife to sit by his side. Adela followed as instructed, and after a few moments of silence, she revealed the thoughts on her mind to Berengar. Something is going on with the Sultan's family. I may not be as talented in the affairs of intrigue as Lind, but I can tell they are plotting something behind the Sultan's back. If you wish to secure this alliance with Granada, it would be wise to investigate this conspiracy silently. If they plan to assassinate Hassan, then you need to prevent it by any means necessary. Not only is this likely to foster a friendship between you and the Sultan, but it will also secure his power in the region. Berengar was shocked when he heard this. However, he noticed their nervous expressions, though he did not even think of such a possibility. Thinking back upon their looks' disdain when the Sultan entertained Berengar's idea of support, it started to make sense. Luckily for him, Berengar had brought several members of his intelligence agency. The reason for this was simple. Lind wanted to keep an eye on him if he did something foolish like flirt with the Princess of Granada. However, the Sultan's sister was wrapped head to toe in a burqa, and Berengar could not lust for her. As such, Berengar and Adela had begun to intertwine themselves with the affairs of the royal Granadan court and would soon be involved in a grand conspiracy, one whose plot had yet to be revealed. Chapter 273 Conspiring Against the Sultan. Late into the night, there was a secret gathering of high-ranking officials within the Emirate of Granada. The Sultan's brother and several advisors were gathered in a part of the castle where they discussed their treasonous thoughts in hushed voices. Yusuf al-Fadl was the younger brother of the Sultan. However, in his mind, his conspiracy that he had established was not a matter of succession, it was a matter of faith. As a religious fundamentalist, he had seen both his elder brother and his father before him spiral into damnation by secular rule. The fact that Hassan entertained the idea of military aid from an infidel while feasting on pork and drinking wine in his spare time was bad enough. However, the Sultan had allowed Adela, a woman, to walk around uncovered. In his eyes, it was simply disgraceful, and the Sultan's lack of faith had gone too far. As such, he was quietly conversing with his co-conspirators in a hidden passage within the castle of Granada. Beside him was the Marshal of the Realm, the Spymaster, and the spiritual advisor who happened to be a high-ranking imam. Their reason for the gathering was simple. Now that a foreign Christian ruler was staying within the castle, they had finally found a scapegoat to pin their plot to assassinate the Sultan on. This scapegoat also acted as the perfect way to establish a theocratic caliphate within the territory of Granada. Yusuf was the first to voice his concerns to his fellow conspirators. Hassan must die. In particular, he must die while this infidel of a duke stays within our territory. If we can blame him as the assassin, then we can rally the faithful against the idea of Christian intervention in our lands and establish our caliphate once and for all. The Imam was the next to voice his discontent with the current situation. The Sultan has gone too far. He allows a woman to walk around freely without escort, and she is even left uncovered. Such blasphemy cannot be tolerated. We must remove Hassan as quickly as possible. The other conspirators nodded their heads in agreement upon hearing this. All of these men were a part of the Islamic fundamentalist faction. They were willing to die to see the secularism they viewed as cancer upon their realm thoroughly removed from society. Ultimately, the Spymaster came up with the first plan to assassinate the current Sultan of Granada. In his hands was a vial of clear liquid. It was an odorless and tasteless poison that Berengar had once used on his father's marshal. This is a lethal concentration of the poison known as arsenic. If we put it in Hassan's wine, he will never know that he devoured it. After he is dead, we can blame the poisoning on this Duke Berengar from Austria. We won't need to fabricate too much evidence. After all, the people will easily buy the idea of a Christian assassinating the Sultan. On the other hand, the Marshal disagreed with this point. Why assassinate the Sultan with poison when they can get one of the house guards to kill him? As such, he voiced his disapproval of this plan immediately and offered a counter-solution. Poison has a chance of failure. A loyal soldier with a blade is more likely to succeed. We should utilize one of the members of the house guard who swears loyalty to the faith to kill the Sultan, then plant the bloodied blade among Berengar's possessions. This way, there is irrefutable proof that the Duke of Austria is responsible for the Sultan's death. Upon hearing two potential options for assassination, the leaders of the conspiracy began to fight among themselves to determine the most effective solution to their current predicament. While these men bickered among themselves, they were completely unaware that they were being observed by a pair of icy blue eyes not far away. After Berengar and Adela finished their chat, Berengar immediately set his agents to task with infiltrating the castle and spying on the most likely suspects of the conspiracy. After dressing in all black and waiting for the night, the agents began to blend in with the dimly lit corridors and successfully followed the conspirators to their meeting place. The men who planned to assassinate the Sultan had no way of knowing that everything they said was observed and documented by this Austrian agent. While this agent watched the conspirators, the men involved continued to fight among themselves until they reached a decision. Yusuf was the one to finalize the decision, and as such, spoke with authority on the matter. "We will use poison to eliminate the Sultan silently, then we will plant a vial of the substance among Berengar's belongings. He will be completely unaware that we are framing him and will make the perfect scapegoat. Tomorrow night, at the negotiations, we will enact our plan. The royal cupbearer will be alerted of our decision and will spike Hassan's drink with the poison." Despite the earlier disagreement, all of the men present nodded their heads in affirmation of the plot to assassinate the Sultan and, shortly after that, departed from the scene of their conspiracy. It was only after they all had left that the agent scurried back to Berengar's quarters, triple-checking along the way to make sure he was not observed. After the coast was clear, he knocked on Berengar's door in a specific way that symbolized he was a member of Berengar's intelligence agency. He then slid the document that he had written recording the conspirators' conversation underneath the door. Afterward, the man disappeared into the darkness and returned to his quarters. His actions were completely unnoticed by the conspirators. As Berengar read the information, he had a smile on his face before lighting the note aflame with a candle. If things turned for the worst, he did not plan to have written evidence of the conspiracy to assassinate the Sultan, even if it were in the form of recording the actual conspirators' conversation. Thus Berengar hatched a plan to spend the next day alongside Hassan and closely watched him to make sure that none of the assassination plots that had been hatched against him came to fruition. Granada was crucial to his plans for the future, and he could not allow it to fall into a state of Islamic fundamentalism. At this moment, he began to hatch a goal to investigate and reveal the conspiracy between the Sultan's brother and several of his councilmen. By doing so, he hoped to gain the favor of the Sultan and forge an alliance between the two. After thinking of his plan, Berengar went to sleep. For the first time in a long time, he was utterly alone at night, making him quite irritable. Eventually, the dawn rose, and Berengar was up bright and early. As usual, he was awake long before the members of his house were. Thus he got out of bed and decided to go for a walk. He traversed the castle's grounds before stumbling upon Hassan awake and hard at work in his study. Interestingly enough, the man had the same habits as Berengar, awakening early and getting to work as soon as possible. Upon seeing this, Berengar instantly began to search for his translator, and after finding him, approached Hassan within his study in an attempt to strike up a conversation. As such, Berengar knocked on the door, which altered the man to his presence. The moment he looked up and gazed upon Berengar's figure with a look of confusion on his face, he inquired about it. "Duke Berengar, what are you doing up so early? Did you not sleep well? Was there something wrong with your accommodations? If they are not to your liking, I can have them changed immediately." To this, Berengar merely shook his head before responding to the young Sultan with a smile on his face. "On the contrary, I was quite pleased with the room I was provided with. It was extremely comfortable. I wake up at this time every day, where I usually get some exercise in before getting straight to work." Upon hearing this, a smile formed across Hassan's face as he got up from his seat and greeted his guest. "We truly do have much in common." In response to this, Berengar nodded his head before asking the Sultan the question on his mind. "Would you like to join me? I know a few exercises that are great for your health. Like I always say, a healthy body creates a healthy mind." Thinking about it for a few moments, Hassan eventually smiled and nodded before speaking his thoughts. "Sure, I was not involved in anything too important anyways." The Duke of Austria and the Sultan of Granada went for a run. Afterward, they began to do push-ups, sit-ups, squats, and pull-ups. By the time they were done with the morning exercise, Hassan was exhausted and in dire need of something to eat. Berengar and Hassan sat down at the breakfast table, covered in sweat, waiting for the morning meal to arrive. With this small action, they had taken the first step to friendship. Chapter 274: Assembling a Crew. While Berengar and Adela were away at the royal court of Granada, Honoria was tasked with another objective. To put it simply, the runaway princess turned privateer queen was in the middle of searching for a crew. At the moment, she was within the city of Kufstein. As per usual, she was flanked by Berengar's guards and protected from any possible threat. The beautiful white-haired princess was no longer dressed in some extravagant noblewoman's dress. Instead, she was dressed in something loosely resembling the naval uniforms Berengar had provided to his sailors. His sailors were dressed like the old Elizabethan sea dogs from his previous life. However, Berengar had custom-designed uniforms for Honoria and her crew rather than have them outright cross-dress. When designing Honoria's privateer attire, Berengar wanted something lightweight, comfy, and easy to move around in. Ultimately, what he created for her was a pair of slim black velvet breeches with minor golden embellishment and a couple of thigh-high black leather boots. For her upper attire, she wore a charcoal gray silk shirt with a black velvet jerkin that was designed for the female body. This jerkin was slightly embellished with golden embroidery. Honoria did not feel like wearing a hat most of the time, but it would be a matching cavalier hat when she did. Honoria also wore a black leather baldric that contained a frog for her sword scabbard to be attached to and a holster that held her 4-shot repeating flintlock, which was based upon the Belton flintlock action from Berengar's previous life. These weapons were an enormous expense to produce, but Berengar had opted to outfit her and her crew with such expensive and effective weaponry for Honoria's safety. After all, if they ever found themselves in close quarters combat with men, they would be at a severe disadvantage. Thus he felt the need to equip them with multi-shot weapons. While Honoria was walking through the city of Kufstein, she noticed a young girl slightly younger than herself being forced to sweep outside a rundown shop. The girl had a pitiful look in her eye, and at the moment, there were a series of screams going on within the shop. From one glance, Honoria could tell this girl was in some trouble and thus opted to approach her. However, despite doing so, the girl refused to look up from the ground as she swept. That is until the door slammed open, and a young man in extravagant attire walked out with a slip of paper in his hands. This young man had a smug grin on his face as he boldly announced to the girl in front of him the fate that awaited her. "Your parents have decided to pay off their debt to me by selling you into my service." However, after saying this, the girl refused to do as she was told and continued to sweep outside the shop. She was aware that so long as the Duke's guard were nearby, no harm could come to her, even from the hands of a nobleman. The man had not seen Honoria or her guards. Instead, he was too focused on the young and cute girl who had taken his fancy. When the girl did not go willingly with him, the man resorted to violence. He latched upon her wrist and tried to force her away. Immediately the young girl resisted, and for doing so, the man slapped her across the face and began to raise his voice at the girl. "You belong to me now. You are nothing more than a slave that I have purchased for my amusement, and you will do what you are told." When Honoria heard this, she began to frown and instantly approached the man. She was greatly displeased with this scene. For starters, Berengar had outright banned slavery. It was illegal and carried a punishment of 25 years to life. There were many reasons for this, but to put it simply, Berengar wanted to avoid the centuries of domestic issues that followed American slavery in his previous life. Thus, by holding what was little more than a slavery contract in his hands and boldly declaring that the young woman belonged to him, he was committing a serious offense. Secondly, Honoria was against the idea of treating women as nothing more than slaves. After all, she had been lucky with Berengar, who allowed her a much greater degree of freedom than women of the period were typically allowed. Thus, when she approached the man, she was far from in a diplomatic mood. Without even addressing the man, she ordered her guards at once. "Guards, arrest this man. He has openly stated that he is engaging in slavery, and Duke Berengar has made his stance on such immoral acts abundantly clear." The moment the young nobleman heard this, he turned around with shock in his eyes. He had not even noticed Honoria or the guards nearby. By now, everyone in Kufstein was aware that Berengar had taken a white-haired beauty from the Byzantine Empire as a lover. As one of Berengar's women, Honoria held the authority to order her guards to act in such a manner. The man immediately tried to declare his innocence. However, the guards grabbed hold of the man and sequestered him. "You don't understand. This is not slavery. It is a simple business transaction. The girl will work off her parents' debt to me until it is fully repaid." However, Honoria was not buying his lame excuse and instead looked at the contract given to her by one of the guards who had seized it from the young nobleman. After reading it thoroughly, Honoria stated the conditions of the contract. In return for absolving the Schneider family of their debt owed to Oswald von Fieberbrunn, Landolf Schneider agrees to sell his daughter Elfrin into the service of Oswald von Fieberbrunn in perpetuity. A lifetime of service to a master that sounds like slavery to me. The man's eyes shrank as he heard this. This deal was supposed to be silent and secret, yet by chance, one of Berengar's lovers was walking by with her guards and witnessed the whole thing. He could be facing a minimum period of 25 years in a labor camp while the maximum sentence carried for slavery was life imprisonment, which meant that he would be forced to work in backbreaking labor until he died. Despite his noble status, under Berengar's legal reforms, he was not afforded any special treatment regarding the law. As such, the man was terrified of the outcome and began to panic. However, he was restrained well by the nearby guards who awaited the arrival of the law enforcement officers to take the man into custody. With no other options, the man began screaming at the young girl he had attempted to buy in a fit of fury. "You bitch, you better pray I never escape. For if I do, you will die a bloody death." There were several eyewitnesses to this man's response, and he had foolishly just stated intent to murder the victim of his crime. Thus, to make an example of him and all potential slavers. Berengar's courts would eventually use this as an excuse to throw the book at the man and keep him in a labor camp until the day he died. Though the man's family would protest these actions, there was nothing they could do in response to the overwhelming power Berengar held. After all, they were a minor noble family climbing the social ladder due to the wealth they gained from owning a few small businesses in Kufstein. After the man was dragged away in chains by the law enforcement agents, Honoria approached the young girl named Elfrin, who was in tears. She was thankful that her life had been spared from a horrific experience of sexual slavery. However, she also lamented the fact that her family was willing to condemn her to such a cruel fate due to their debt to the minor nobleman. With no options, the girl began to despair, and Honoria knew this to be the case. As such, she presented a viable alternative to the girl. "You are a free woman now, and thus the choice of what you do in the future is up to you, but if I were you, I wouldn't want to stay with a family who so easily sold me into slavery either." As Elfrin wept, she spoke the thoughts on her mind to the beautiful and comforting young woman next to her. "I have nowhere else to go, but I can never look at my parents the same way after this." With a gentle smile on her face, Honoria clasped the girl's shoulder, causing her to look up at her with shock. Honoria proceeded to drag the girl into her arms and hugged her while stroking her long, dirty blonde hair. "If you have nowhere else to go, then you can join me. I am putting together a crew to set sail across the Mediterranean. Adventure and glory await. Are you up to the task?" Upon hearing this, Elfrin had a glimmer in her eyes. The offer enticed her, and as such, she swallowed her tears before nodding with firm resolve. Such a fate was better than lying around in Kufstein waiting to be sold off to another man. With that said, Honoria had gotten her first crew member. She just needed a few dozen more, and she would have a full-sized crew to man her future sloop of war. Of course, training these wenches to be an effective privateer crew was another story entirely. Chapter 275 Conspiring Against the Conspirators. After eating breakfast with the Sultan of Granada, Berengar took his morning bath. Though the bathhouse in the castle of Granada was better than most, it still failed to compare to the elaborate design that Berengar had made for himself. However, it was enough to get the job done, and after finishing his bath, Berengar got dressed in his extravagant attire before regrouping with Adela. The young woman looked visibly stressed, as if she had been contemplating what actions to take during the entirety of her sleep. Nevertheless, Berengar grabbed a hold of his little fiancée and shoved her into his arms as he stroked her silky golden hair. The girl had just left her quarters before running into Berengar, and as such, she was curious about the intelligence Berengar could collect in the previous night. As such, she looked around cautiously to make sure nobody else was nearby before asking the question in her mind in a calm voice. "What did you find out?" Berengar nuzzled his cheek against her to put on a show of affection. If anyone were secretly watching their moves, they would think the two were embracing each other like a couple usually did. After getting close to her ears, he whispered to his little fiancée. "It is worse than we thought. Yusuf, the younger brother of Hassan, and at least 3 of his ministers are involved in a plot to assassinate the Sultan and pin the blame onto us. They intend to create a theocratic caliphate here in Granada." Though Adela was shocked to hear this, she played the part of a fiancée who was being doted on by her future husband, and as such, she did not make any facial expressions to indicate her true feelings. "When do they plan to do it?" Berengar danced around with Adela slightly as he kissed her forehead before speaking further about the plans. Tonight at dinner, they intend to poison Hassan's drink. The cupbearer is part of the conspiracy. I have already dispatched my agents to gather more intelligence. We cannot allow this to unfold. After saying this, Berengar broke away from the long hug and held onto Adela's hand tightly while acting as if they were not just conspiring. Well, my love, I think it is time for you to get some breakfast. I have already eaten with the Sultan, but I will accompany you anyway. With this, Adela nodded and followed Berengar to the dining hall, where the rest of Hassan's dynasty were busy eating breakfast. As for Berengar, he silently observed the discussions that were taking place at the table. After a while, the meal was over, and Adela and Berengar were free to return to their business. Berengar searched for the Sultan and eventually found him in his study once more. As such, Berengar decided to investigate whether Hassan knew he was being conspired against. Thus, he shut the door behind him as he began to question the young Sultan in a not too obvious way. Berengar had brought his translator with him, though the topic they would be discussing was confidential. The man who Berengar used as a translator was from his own court, and was someone Berengar could trust with critical information. As such, he began to speak with Hassan while his words were translated into Arabic. Pardon me if it is not my place, but I get the feeling that some of your ministers are not exactly welcome to the idea of me staying here. When Hassan heard this, he began to frown, not over Berengar's choice of words, but because Berengar was correct when he said that. As such, he sighed heavily before resting his face in his hands. It was only after a few moments that Hassan began to speak. My brother is a deeply religious person and is foolish enough to believe that the imams should run the state. I do not know where he got such beliefs. What I know is that he is deeply disturbed by our family's more secular nature as rulers. Thus, he has been conspiring with my more fanatical advisors for some time. I fear eventually they will make an attempt on my life. I am sorry to trouble you with such things. I suppose you also must have a hard time at home. After all, you are one of the figureheads of the German Reformation, and there must be die-hard Catholics who surround and scheme against you. Berengar sat in front of the man and took out a flask from his pocket and took a sip from it. The Sultan eyed the flask thoughtfully as Berengar did so. Seeing the hopeful expression on the man's face, Berengar plugged the flask and tossed it over to him before explaining its contents. It is a fortified wine. We make it in southern Tyrol. It has become one of my favorite drinks. The man quickly took off the flask's cap before smelling it. After doing so, he had a taste. When he did so, his eyes began to shine with excitement before he took another swig. After drinking his fill, he handed the flask back to Berengar, which was half empty, and Berengar merely chuckled in response. You like it, huh? To this, the Sultan nodded his head before sighing heavily. It is a damn shame I can't drink openly. The more faithful of my followers would become disgruntled if they saw me doing such a thing. In response to this, Berengar took another swig before addressing the Sultan's previous concerns. I can't say I had issues with fanatical Catholics in my ranks. I did a thorough purge of such people during my rise to power. They were removed from their positions of power and replaced with like-minded people. If what you say is true, the fanatics in your court are already plotting your death. I would be careful if I were you. Anyone who remotely disfavors your secular nature could be a threat. Tell me, who in your court would you label as a fanatic? Hassan thought about it for a few moments before he came to a sudden realization. Among all of the members of his court, few looked fondly upon his secular rule. Most of them were religious fundamentalists. As such, he quickly began to write down a list of potential suspects and their occupations. Among the members listed were his brother, most of his advisors, his cupbearer, his cooks, and even 2 of his wives. He began to become filled with paranoia as he thought about these people as potential assassins. Eventually, Hassan looked up at Berengar with a look of panic in his eyes, which slowly began to turn into a look of terror. What do I do? Any one of these people who are close to me could be a potential assassin. Berengar's lips began to curve into a wicked smile as he began to fill the young Sultan with ideas of tyranny. As such, he took a sip from the flask once more before speaking the thoughts on his mind. Anyone, no matter what their relation to you, who is a potential threat should be removed from any position where they could endanger your life. Your cupbearer, for example, I see you have listed him as a potential threat. What if tonight is the night he slips poison into your chalice? Several of your cooks are listed as well. They could easily poison your food without you realizing it. Your marshal? He can rally religious fundamentalists in your army to attack you personally. The captain of your house guard? He can turn them against you at any time. What you need to do is remove these people immediately while surrounding yourself with allies. I do not mean to suggest surrounding yourself with sycophants who tell you what you want to hear. They're equally dangerous. You need people to support you, people who share your vision. There must be some people in your court who believe in your cause. I find it hard to believe that your father could rule for so long as a secular ruler without being assassinated if everyone in this kingdom is a religious fundamentalist like you have surrounded yourself with. You should make a list of your loyal followers, men who would kill and die for you, and have them remove every person on this list tonight at dinner. If necessary, do not be afraid to shed blood. Do not partake of the food or drink until you have secured your position. That is my suggestion. Hassan took Berengar's words to heart but did not immediately proceed to implement them into action. Instead, he looked at Berengar with a gaze of confusion before asking the question on his mind. Why are you willing to help me to such a degree? We barely know each other, and we come from two different worlds. Berengar's expression sank to one of pure coldness as he addressed the young sultan over his concerns. I have seen men of every denomination kill and die in the name of their religion. These men should never be afforded a position of power. It only brings death and destruction to every poor soul caught in their wake. Though I have not known you for long, I can tell you are a man capable of bringing your people into a new golden age, one where a man isn't persecuted by the faithful because he views the world through a different lens than religion. The path to power is filled with the corpses of your enemies. If you do not have the stomach to do what is necessary, then one day, the enemies surrounding you will succeed in claiming your life. You asked why I was helping you? You could say it is because I would rather not see the potential of a great man snuffed out by religious fanatics. With this said, Berengar raised from his seat and approached the door. It was only after he had grasped upon the knob and began to open it that he revealed the last part of his train of thought. For the record, I killed my brother when he made an attempt on my life. If only I had done it sooner, I might have saved myself from the loss of my right eye. Learn from my mistake, and spare yourself some suffering. After leaving behind his message, Berengar left the Sultan's study and allowed the young man to dwell upon their discussion. Whether or not Hassan would be able to survive the night depended entirely upon how he proceeded with the information Berengar provided him. Chapter 276 Purging the Opposition. The time had finally come. Once more, Hassan had thrown a giant feast to celebrate the arrival of his guests from the east. Those guests, of course, were Berengar and his host. At the same time, Hassan sat at the head of the table with his first wife and his family gathering beside him. Yusuf sat at the other end of the table with his allies nearby. Berengar and his host were caught between two factions vying for power in the middle of the table. He did not know whether or not Hassan had taken their conversation seriously, but either way, he would be in for a good show tonight. Berengar had decided to take a gamble and allow the young sultan to grow as a ruler. Thus, aside from having his guard nearby to protect the lives of Adela and himself, Berengar planned to sit back and watch the show. He was not nervous in the slightest. However, Adela was having a difficult time sitting still. She was filled with anxiety and feared the potential of the sultan being poisoned, and she and Berengar taking the blame. Seeing his fiancée getting fidgety, Berengar grabbed a hold of her hand and whispered to her with a voice filled with confidence. Relax, everything is going to be fine. Upon feeling the warmth of Berengar's hand, Adela began to calm down. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath while gripping Berengar's hand tightly. As time passed, the food was eventually brought to the table, where Berengar and Adela waited for the Muslims to say their prayers. After that was over, Berengar eyed Hassan with hidden intent. While doing so, the cupbearer was beginning to pour Hassan's wine. Though Berengar had not outright said that the chalice would be poisoned, he heavily implied it. Thus, he hoped that the young sultan would not be foolish enough to take a drink from it. After catching Berengar's gaze, Hassan nodded in return, which signaled to Berengar that everything was going to be okay. Seeing this, Berengar began to relax his grip on Adela's hand slightly. Instead, he began to drink from the fruit juice which was poured for their consumption. He knew his glass would not be poisoned. After all, he was the scapegoat the conspirators intended to implicate in their crime. Thus he took a heavy swig before placing the chalice down. After doing so, Hassan tapped his goblet with a spoon, gaining everyone's attention before giving a speech. I would like to make a toast to our guests from Austria. I see great things happening between our two realms shortly. They have journeyed a long way to help us in our time of need, and as such, I would like to personally thank Duke Berengar for the assistance he has provided me during his stay. When these words were spoken, Yusuf and his allies looked at each other with troubled gazes. They did not know precisely what Hassan was referring to. However, it did not matter. In the end, Hassan would still be poisoned, and Berengar would take the blame, or so they thought. After saying his piece, Hassan lifted his glass in the air and said the final words of his toast. To a new golden age. Berengar quickly raised his glass and replied before drinking its contents. As for Hassan, he did not take a drink from the glass and instead placed it on the table, still filled to the brim. In doing so, Yusuf and his allies became alarmed. Hassan was supposed to drink the fruit juice laced with arsenic, yet he had not done so. As such, Yusuf began to put on the facade of a concerned brother as he asked Hassan the question on his mind. Dearest brother, is your stomach upset? Why do you not drink after your toast? To this, Hassan merely sneered as he pushed the glass across the table, sliding it over to Yusuf without spilling a drop. After doing so, he gazed at Yusuf with an intimidating glare. Brother, prove your loyalty to me and drink from this chalice. After all, if you truly supported me, you would be happy to make sure that I am not about to be poisoned, would you not? The moment Hassan said this, Yusuf's eyes opened wide in shock, as did his allies. Yusuf began to protest as he tried not to drink from the chalice that he knew was poisoned. I would not dare drink from the Sultan's prized chalice. It would be disrespectful. In response to this, Hassan smiled cruelly and spoke his mind. I am afraid I am going to have to insist. Immediately after saying this, the young Sultan snapped his fingers. In doing so, the house guard who were present immediately restrained Yusuf and his allies at the table, as well as the cupbearer who poisoned the drink. While Yusuf struggled desperately from the grasp of the house guards who held him in place, one of the men loyal to Hassan had a wicked smile on his face as he picked up the poisoned chalice and forced its contents down Yusuf's throat. Within seconds, Yusuf began to foam at the mouth as he broke out into seizures, eventually passing away on the spot. Upon seeing this, the women present started to shriek in horror, including Adela, who was sitting next to Berengar. Berengar, of course, was enjoying the sight as if it were the most entertaining show he had ever watched. After Yusuf's body collapsed onto the floor, Hassan gave a new decree to the guards present who were loyal to him. My brother tried to poison me. The men who sit next to him conspired against my life so that they could usurp my position. Kill them all. With this said, the house guards unleashed their blades as they began to slaughter the religious fanatics who comprised Hassan's royal court. Immediately a spear was thrust through the back of the marshal where it protruded through his chest. Blood spilled onto the table as the spymaster gazed in horror at the sight. However, before he could react, his jugular and carotid arteries were cut open by another man loyal to the Sultan. As this was going on, Berengar's guards surrounded him and Adela, forming a wall of steel around their master and his fiancée to protect them from the chaos. They wielded their muskets with bayonets affixed in all directions, prepared to kill anyone who decided to harm them. As for Hassan, he sat down at the table and began to dig into the food. Seeing the banquet host taking the first bite, Berengar followed suit. In the middle of the bloodshed, two rulers partook of the meat on the table as if the gruesome sight did not cause the slightest bit of discomfort. Before long, the guards had cleared the dining hall and had begun to spread through every corner of the castle, killing everyone on the list of names that Hassan had written as a potential assassin within his court. Sounds of steel clashing with steel resounded as the royal guard began to fight among themselves. Those loyal to Hassan had been alerted of this event beforehand and were adequately armed and prepared for the slaughter. Yusuf and his allies had no way of knowing that Hassan had the guards loyal to them taken off duty for the night and replaced with those loyal to himself. After all, chainmail veils covered all of their faces. After slaughtering the opposition at the dinner table, the loyal guards proceeded to the rest quarters of the disloyal guards and began to kill them in their sleep. Some had woken up due to the sounds of chaos and prepared themselves, but it was not enough to spare their lives. While Berengar dined upon the roasted lamb, he commented on the flavor as if the bloodbath transpiring around them was non-existent. I will tell you one thing. Lamb is the king of all meats, and your chefs know how to prepare it wonderfully. Hassan sighed upon hearing this before responding with a dejected expression. It is a pity most of my kitchen staff are going to be purged tonight. Berengar merely nodded his head upon hearing this and responding in an equally depressing voice. It is a pity indeed. Adela was in the middle of her seat, freaking out. She had never seen such violence and brutality. It was shocking for her. As she began to panic, Berengar grabbed a hold of her hand and tried to calm her down. Relax, sweetheart. Everything will be fine. Adela unknowingly began to scream at Berengar as she raised from her seat. Fine? How can you call this fine? How are you so calm in a situation like this? How can you still eat despite all this bloodshed? I think I am going to be sick. After saying this, Adela leaned over and hurled up the contents of her stomach. The sights and smells were too much for her fragile mind to handle. Berengar deeply regretted bringing her along. Such a sight was something he never wanted her to witness. Berengar sat Adela down next to him and began to rub her shoulders as he comforted her. Her gaze was affixed on the floor below, too frightened to look up at the savage display that surrounded her. If I had known things would end up like this, I would have never brought you here, Adela. I am truly sorry. However, I am a man who has fought on the front lines of war. This is trivial compared to what I have witnessed. While he was comforting Adela, one of Hassan's wives pulled out a dagger from her dress and charged at the young sultan. However, before she could reach him with her blade, one of Berengar's guards lowered his musket and fired a golf ball-sized hole through her chest, killing her on the spot. A few of the other guards immediately lowered their rifled muskets as well, presenting a threat to the sultan's other wives. Upon seeing this, Hassan was shocked. He knew some of his wives were among the opposition, but he never thought they would dare kill him. As such, he wiped the sweat from his brow before addressing Berengar. Thanks. If not for your warning or your men, I would have died tonight. Berengar shook his head. He was still comforting Adela when he spoke to Hassan and thus was relatively calm about the whole thing. Not a problem, so I have to ask what happens now. As the screams of the slaughter continued in the background, Hassan began to speak of his plans for the future. In the upcoming days, I will purge the opposition from my army when only men loyal to me remain among its ranks. We can discuss the military aid you offered. I owe you my life, and a military alliance between our two kingdoms is the least I can do to repay you. While listening to Hassan's plans, Berengar poured some of his fortified wine into his chalice. After Hassan was finished speaking, he lifted the goblet in the air and spoke the words. Assalamu alaikum. In response to this, Hassan raised his new chalice as well before responding with the phrase. Wa alaikum salam. The purges of the kingdom of Granda would go on for a few more days. Thousands of conspirators from every facet of society and those loyal to them would be slaughtered by Hassan as he solidified his power as the Sultan of Granada. After all, not all of the religious fundamentalists who wanted Hassan removed were stationed in Granada. By the end of this event, Sultan Hassan al-Fadl would reign supreme in the Emirate of Granada, and in doing so, provided Berengar with a valuable ally in Iberia. With Berengar's interference, the era of secular rule in Granada had truly begun. Chapter 277. You are right, it is not meant to be. A week had passed since the fateful night where Berengar convinced Hassan to purge his kingdom of the faction of religious fanatics who intended to overthrow his legitimate and secular government in favor of a theocratic caliphate. During this time, Berengar comforted Adela over the overwhelming stress and anxiety she felt during the purge. As a show of thanks to Berengar's support, Hassan had given Berengar a beachside villa off the coast of Gibraltar. This beachside house was delivered in perpetuity to the von Kufstein dynasty as a show of friendship. While Hassan was busy purging the remaining opposition forces within his kingdom, Berengar watched Adela play on the beach while sipping on a glass filled with fortified wine. For the first time since Berengar had transmigrated to this world, he was finally able to see a pretty girl in a bikini. That's right, knowing that he would be traveling to Iberia, Berengar purposely had a bikini made for Adela. Because Berengar had yet to develop the process for creating nylon and other synthetic materials, Berengar could only resort to using natural fibers like hemp. Hemp was breathable and dried quickly. As such, it was a good substitute for nylon when making swimwear. In fact, he was wearing modern-style swim trunks fashioned from the material. The fresh air of the Mediterranean combined with the fun of the beach had begun to lift Adela's spirit after the brutal slaughter she had witnessed. Considering that a large chunk of the beach was reserved for Berengar and his dynasty's private use, there was not another person visible for several hundred meters. Adela's bikini was sapphire in color like her eyes, and she was pretty embarrassed while wearing such little clothing. However, Berengar had assured her it was only natural to wear light clothing on a beach, and considering she did not know any better, she decided to trust him. Which, speaking from a modern perspective, this was the truth. Besides, even if she could not admit it, it was exciting to be alone with Berengar and catch his fancy without any other girls interfering for once. As such, she began to construct a sandcastle on the beach while Berengar watched her with joy. It was not until some time later that Berengar's fun was interrupted by a messenger on horseback. He had ridden from Granada to give Berengar a letter. As Berengar opened the letter and read its contents, his smile began to fade, and he nodded at the rider before sending him back to his master. Berengar quickly approached Adela, informing her of the business at hand. "Looks like our little vacation is over. Now is the time to return to Granda and discuss the terms of our newfound alliance with the Sultan." Upon hearing this, Adela's eye began to show panic, and Berengar understood why. After witnessing such a horrific scene, Adela had no desire to go back to Granada. The very thought of it could induce panic attacks. As such, he hugged the girl who was beginning to breathe heavily and stroked her golden hair. "It is fine, you can stay here and enjoy the beach, but I have to go. I will make sure some of my guards stay behind to protect you." Despite Berengar's kindness, Adela shook her head and steeled her resolve. She responded to Berengar with a look of great determination in her eyes. "I will not be your burden. You asked me to come with you to ensure that your diplomatic efforts succeed. Even though I can't do much, I can still make sure you remain calm if things get heated. So despite my misgivings, I will accompany you. After all, I am your wife." Berengar's jaw nearly fell agape as he heard this. All he could think of in his mind was one simple phrase. "This girl is too cute." With that, he picked Adela up and carried her princess style back to the manor, where they began to separate so that they could change into the appropriate attire. After doing so, they stepped out of the castle and entered the carriage prepared for them by the Sultan. After traveling for a few days, they finally arrived in Granada, where Adela had difficulty stepping out of the carriage and into the castle. Berengar grasped onto her shaking hand as he led her into the castle. Thankfully, any sign of the massacre that had previously taken place here was thoroughly cleaned up, as if it had never happened, allowing Adela to breathe easily. After traversing through the castle into the Sultan's great hall, Berengar and Adela stood before the Sultan of Granada, who stood up from his seat and approached Berengar while smiling. Hassan grabbed a hold of Berengar and hugged him as if he were a long-lost brother. After a few seconds, he let go of his grasp and began to speak to Berengar about what had happened over the last week. "My friend, it is great to see you. I can assure you that the fanatics who oppose my rule have been eliminated. There is no threat to my power left within my emirate, and it is all thanks to your advice. If I did not have you to guide me, I would have been killed on that dreadful night. I hope the villa was to your liking?" In response to this, Berengar smiled and clasped the man's shoulder as he nodded his head with a smile on his face. "It was wonderful. You have a beautiful country. I look forward to spending much of my future at the villa you have provided my family and me." Hassan smiled and nodded as he spoke to Berengar. "Excellent, excellent. I knew you would enjoy it. Again, I am so sorry you had to witness that barbaric display. I assure you, I am taking every precaution to appoint loyal and competent subjects as you have advised. Now we can discuss matters of state without the interference of those fanatics." Berengar walked by Hassan's side, and Adela followed behind the two men as they chatted. Berengar fully announced his plans for the future of their two states. "I will be frank with you, Hassan. Within a year, I intend to become fully independent of the Holy Roman Empire, establishing the Kingdom of Austria. The Emperor plots against me, and I can no longer remain loyal to a man who would try to sabotage my people's wealth and happiness over religious differences. More than anything, I need an ally, someone dependable, someone like-minded, and someone with the potential to grow alongside me. I suggest comprehensive trade agreements between our two kingdoms to expand our wealth further, but more importantly, a powerful military alliance between our two states. I can supply you with arms, armor, and munitions at a discounted price, and even provide you with military advisors for 5 years so that your troops can become fully equipped with the knowledge and resources to defeat your enemies. In return, all that I ask is that if I ever come into a situation where I am incapable of defending my borders by myself, that you aid me. In return for this, I promise to do the same for you, my friend." When Hassan heard this, he was pretty shocked. Berengar was making quite a large request of the Sultan. However, the Sultan also knew that Berengar's armies were among the best in Europe. As such, he was interested in the offer and thus voiced his concerns on the matter. "When you say you will provide me with arms, armor, and munitions, I assume you are not referring to the ones that your army utilizes." Berengar began to chuckle as he heard this and responded honestly. "You would be correct. I won't lie to you. I intend to maintain the stranglehold I have over advanced military technology. However, what I can do is provide you with the arms, armor, munitions, and tactics I have sold to the Byzantines." Hassan's interest grew further when he heard this. What Berengar had offered him was a far better deal than what Berengar gave the Hussites. While Berengar officially had no ties to the Hussites, Hassan was not foolish enough to believe Berengar was innocent of what he proclaimed himself regarding the war in Bohemia. The fact that Berengar was willing to provide the same level of assistance to Hassan that he offered to the Byzantines proved that the young duke was sincere about the alliance with Granada. After all, the Byzantines had begun to make significant advances into Egypt and Libya throughout the last year, mainly due to Berengar's equipment. After hearing this, Hassan sighed and voiced his concerns over the arrangement. Normally, an alliance like this is sealed with marriage. Before Berengar could allow Hassan to finish the statement, he interjected. "Don't even think about it. I already have 3 women. If I add another one, I am almost certain at least one of my girls will kill me in my sleep." Hassan began to chuckle at this response and gazed over at Adela, who was pouting silently to Berengar's words. There was no denying it. The fury in her eyes showed that 2 other girls were already her limit as the main wife. Adela outright refused to allow Berengar to take in some Moorish whore as yet another bride-to-be. Seeing the terrifying look on Adela's cute little face, Hassan clasped Berengar's shoulder and sighed. "You have my sympathies, my friend. I too know what it is like to have one of your wives make an attempt on your life. Fine, forget what I said. Since I owe you my life, this request of a comprehensive alliance between our 2 realms is a small thing to ask. We will draft a mutually beneficial treaty for our people, and I will be more than happy to sign it. It is just a shame." Berengar was smiling throughout Hassan's response, but when he heard that last part, it made him instinctively curious, and as such, Berengar asked the question on his mind. "What is?" Hassan chuckled as he heard this before replying. "My little sister is quite beautiful and in need of a husband." "Oh well, I guess it is not meant to be." Hearing this, Berengar nearly cursed under his breath, but he felt the murderous gaze of Adela watching over his every move and thus sighed instead. "You are right, it is not meant to be." Chapter 278 The King's Sorrows. Aubry was back at the palace in Paris. His father, King Gilles de Valois of France, was currently in the process of scolding the errant prince. For the past year, Aubry had been fighting alongside one of his lovers, the Duke of Burgundy, against the English invasion. Rumors began to spread of the Holy Maiden of France, and they had inspired a fighting spirit within the French people. As such, the French had started to make significant gains, that is until now. The Duke of Burgundy had made a shocking announcement on this day. He would be seceding from France and pledging his support to the English crown. Few knew the actual reason for him doing so, and it had begun to cause speculation within the French royal court as to why the Duke would suddenly turn sides despite the French beginning to gain the upper hand in the conflict. The reason for this was quite simple. The Duke of Burgundy found out that Prince Aubry was cheating on him with a total of 4 other lovers. Feeling betrayed and outraged that the young man he had pledged his love to was such a filthy slut, the Duke of Burgundy declared open rebellion against the French crown. Because of this, France had once more begun to enter into a state of defeat, as they were now being attacked on both sides by their enemies, splitting their armies in 2 to combat the new threat from within. Gilles was one of the few men aware of the reasoning for the Duke of Burgundy's betrayal, and he only had one person he could blame. That being his errant son, who liked to dress up as a woman and get rammed by other men. Seeing his son kneeling before him, who looked prettier than his daughter, caused Gilles to spit upon the youth in disgust. Your degeneracy truly knows no bounds, my son. I would have thought that you learned your lesson by now, but you can't behave yourself, can you? Aubrey had a calm expression. He had been in this situation many times before, and as such, was well aware that his father's punishment would never be too severe. Thus he merely sat there stoically waiting for his father's critique of his behavior to end. Do you not have anything to say for yourself? Are you not sorry for the damage your actions have caused? The lives that have been lost? Do you have any idea what you have done to this kingdom? With each question the king asked, his tone of voice grew more furious, and so too did it become louder. Still, Aubrey did not speak a word while being scolded in such an outrageous manner. Sibylla, on the other hand, gazed at Aubrey from the other side of the chamber. She was Aubrey's elder sister and the only princess of France. Though nobody knew it, it was precisely her fault that Aubrey turned into a cross-dressing freak. She had always been envious of Aubrey's natural beauty, even when they were children, and as such, she had spent a great deal of time dressing Aubrey up in girls' clothes and putting makeup on him. Eventually, such behavior influenced the boy into the young man he had become. Even she was amazed at the body count Aubrey had behind him. Princess Sibylla was by no means pure, despite being unmarried, but she was far from as experienced as Aubrey was. Such a thing was another point of contention in her heart, as more than once, guys she wanted to get with passed her by so they could sleep with her cross-dressing little brother. After all of this, Aubrey was somehow labeled the Holy Maiden of France and caused such a huge fiasco. She was both impressed and envious of Aubrey's talents in attracting men. As such, she merely sat by and watched with glee as her younger brother was scolded for his lecherous actions that had led to the Duke of Burgundy acting in rebellion. Eventually, the king sighed heavily before calming himself down. He rested his head within his hands before coming to a decision. I have no choice but to send you to the front lines again. You will bring back the head of your former lover, or you will never be allowed to return to this palace. Do I make myself understood? Aubrey snickered as he heard this lenient sentence for his crimes and responded to his father like an obedient child. Yes, Daddy. The king's skin instantly crawled when he heard this. Every time his son referred to him in such a manner, it made him want to cut his own ears off. Aubrey needed to be taught a proper lesson, but he simply did not have the heart to be so cruel. Aubrey raised from his position and left the great hall, leaving the king alone with his only daughter. Sibylla immediately began to chastise her father for being so lenient with Aubrey. Tisk, tisk, tisk. The King of France is being lenient on his children once again. Do you ever wonder if that's the reason we all turned out so sinful? The moment she said this, the king's expression worsened as he heard his equally as disappointing daughter enter the fray. As such, he responded with a weary face. Sibylla, my only daughter, don't you have something better to do? For example, you could be skinning a puppy or pushing a baker's son into the oven at this very moment. Anything other than giving this old man even greater heartache. Sibylla immediately began to protest as she heard this. You push the baker's son into an oven one time, and you never live it down. No, father, I do not have anything better to do at the moment besides watch you slap Aubrey on the wrist for causing the Duke of Burgundy to rebel against you. The king immediately began to fire back at Sibylla's response as he began to chastise her as well. Don't even get started with me, young lady. You have caused your fair share of internal rebellion. Remember the time you caused the Duchy of Aquitaine to side with the English because you nailed the Duke's scrotum to his bedframe. As Sibylla heard this, she began to giggle wickedly. She had completely forgotten about the incident and began to mock the events. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Of course, it was his fault. He told me I couldn't make him cry in bed, and I took that as a challenge. The King of France began to sigh once more as he heard his daughter's reasoning for her actions. Sometimes he swore that God was punishing him by giving him such wicked children. Aubrey was a lustful crossdresser, and Sibylla was a violent psychopath. His other two children were not much better. One was a lazy glutton, and the other was a greedy coward. He could swear that if he ended up having 7 children, they would each be the personification of at least one of the 7 deadly sins. He had no idea how his children turned out so horrible. Maybe Sibylla was right. Perhaps he was a terrible father who allowed them to get away with too much mischief. As he thought about such things, Sibylla began to laugh once more before speaking the thoughts on her mind. Do you actually trust Aubrey to lead an army against the Duke of Burgundy? I mean, he will probably just end up sleeping with all of his knights. To think that the legendary Holy Maiden of France is nothing more than a perverted prince. It is hilarious, isn't it? At this point, the king had suffered enough of his daughter's torment and got up from his seat before slapping her across the face. "Get out of my sight." In response to this, Sibylla snarled at the king as if she were some wild beast before turning away and walking towards her room, leaving the King of France alone on his throne, thinking about how he had managed to screw up so much as a father and as a king. Aside from his wayward children, there were several other things that the king had been lamenting as of late. The war against England would not be ending any time soon, and none of his children were up to the task of leading the armies against the invaders. His most excellent general had just turned against him because of his son's scandalous actions, and now he was left with a war on 3 fronts. The English invaded from the north and the southwest, and now he had to fight the Burgundians in the southeast. Things did not look like they could get much worse. He knew that when the English king heard about this latest betrayal, he would be laughing up a storm at the misery and humiliation that the French royal dynasty had suffered on this day. As such, the French king had turned to his most recent pastime, the method that most depressed people used to get through the day. Thus the French king poured himself a chalice filled with wine and began to drink his sorrows away. Chapter 279 Alliance of Gibraltar. At the moment, Berengar and Hassan were sitting across from each other in the middle of the villa that had been given to Berengar. The two men had a scribe draft up a copy of the alliance agreement that was to take effect between the two realms. Berengar and Hassan sat for several hours and debated the clauses and stipulations added to the treaty. By the time the sun began to set, the document was drafted in its final state and was fully agreed on between the two parties. After several re-readings to ensure that everything was 100% correct, the two men signed it into effect. This was more than a mutual defensive pact. What the two rulers signed would later become known as the Alliance of Gibraltar. This treaty stipulated several essential factors, one of them guaranteeing independence between the two realms. The other portions of the treaty included a mutual defense pact and a comprehensive trade agreement to ensure the prosperity of both nations. After it was signed into law, Berengar had done the unthinkable. A Christian duke had established a long-term alliance with a Muslim emirate. As part of the trade agreement, Berengar would supply the Emirate of Granada with arms, armor, and munitions at a discounted price of 25%. It was a better deal than he was giving the Byzantines, and though Hassan was not aware of this, he did suspect it. Berengar's reasoning for this was simple: the Byzantine Empire was mighty enough without his weapons and could be a bulwark against his enemies. In comparison, Granada was pretty weak, and as such, Berengar had to bolster their strength as quickly as possible if they were going to prove to be a menace to their Catholic neighbors when the time for it was needed. After signing the defensive pact, Berengar pulled out a bottle of fortified wine and opened it on the spot, pouring it into a pair of crystal glasses. Though Hassan had previously seen such prominent glassware in the market, as Berengar had already begun trading in Granada, he did not own a set himself. After swirling the red liquid in his cup for a few moments, Berengar sniffed the aroma that the alcoholic beverage provided before taking a sip from it. He swirled it around his tongue for a few moments before swallowing it and exhaling as he did so. Wine does not get better than this. Hassan began to drink from his glass similarly. He seemed to enjoy the product. As he swallowed from the cup's contents, he exhaled before exclaiming the thoughts in his mind. "I trust that this wine will be included in our trade agreement." Upon hearing this, Berengar broke out into laughter and made a jest towards his new friend. "Of course, though I doubt it will sell well in Granada. After all, it is forbidden in your holy book to drink alcohol." Hassan also began to chuckle as he heard Berengar's comment. However, he knew that there were still plenty of men who drank wine, and as such, he decided to inform Berengar of this. That is true, and most people adhere to such strict principles. However, there are still quite a few among us who love the taste of wine. I assure you, those noblemen who care for such things will pay a premium to get their hands on this. After hearing this, Berengar nodded before drinking from his glass once more. After he finished sipping on the fortified wine, he agreed to sell the product in Granada. "Well, if that is the case, I will have no problem selling you this wine. Of course, I have plenty of other types of alcohol if you are interested, some are even stronger than this." After Hassan heard this, his eyes nearly jumped out of his sockets. This was already stronger than any drink he had ever tasted, at least in terms of alcohol content. He had trouble believing Berengar's words. However, the next moment Berengar pulled out a small bottle filled with an amber substance. It was some of the whiskey he had been distilling in Kufstein for some time now. After pouring the beverage into a small shot glass, he downed it in one go. Berengar proceeded to directly pour another one for Hassan with a cruel smile on his face. However, Hassan did not know what Berengar was planning and instead was looking at Berengar as if he were an idiot. When he saw the minuscule amount of liquid Berniger had provided him, he could not help but be offended. "My friend, is this a joke, or are you just being stingy?" As Berengar heard this, he had a wicked grin on his face as he challenged Hassan to drink it whole. "If you can drink everything in that small glass in one go without choking, I will give you 5 whole bottles for free. How about that?" Seeing Berengar just downed the contents of the small glass as if it were nothing, Hassan felt pretty confident, and as such, he smiled at Berengar before grabbing a hold of the shot glass and dumping the contents down his throat. The moment he did, he instantly regretted it as he felt all of the cells in his mouth immediately dehydrate. As Hassan choked on the liquid for several moments, Berengar laughed and clapped in the background. While the two men were having a foolish bet, Adela was down on the beach below, playing with the crabs on the beach. Berengar occasionally watched her do so, and he was not the only one. Hassan was surprised that she was wearing so little clothing. After all, she was dressed in the hemp bikini Berengar had made for her, and as such, the young sultan was attracted to her. Noticing Hassan's gaze, Berengar snapped him out of it with a sharp response. "Don't even think about it." Hearing the chilling tone in Berengar's voice, the slightly intoxicated sultan realized he had done wrong and apologized. "I am sorry, it must be the alcohol, that is some wildly strong shit. Still, I have to ask, why do you let your woman dress in so little clothing?" Berengar merely laughed at this comment as he responded to Hassan's inquiry. "Because I enjoy the sight. Also, she's on the beach. What else is she supposed to wear? There are few better sights in this world than a pretty girl in a bikini." Hassan had no idea what a bikini was, but he could guess by the context of Berengar's statement that it was the item of clothing that Adela was wearing. As such, he thought of a brilliant idea. "How much for these bikinis? I want some for my wives." Berengar chuckled in response to this. Few men could resist the allure of a pretty girl in a bikini. As such, Berengar decided to do Hassan a favor. "Send me your wives' measurements, and I will be happy to get a few of them made for your women. I will send them with the next shipment to Granda for no extra charge." Hassan immediately began to smile as he decided to drink more whiskey. He could already imagine what his beautiful wives would look like in such little attire. After drinking for a while longer, Berengar and Adela began to see Hassan off. The man was reasonably intoxicated at this point and looked at Berengar with fondness. "Until we meet again, my friend, it is just a shame you have to return to your home so soon." Berengar nodded and sighed. "I enjoyed the time we spent together. I look forward to your future visit to my homeland. When you arrive, I can show off all of our cuisines. I am sure you will enjoy it." With that said, Hassan got into his carriage and began his journey back to his home in Granada. As for Berengar and Adela, they would be sailing back to Kufstein in the following morning. As such, Berengar wanted to spend a little bit more time with his fiancée. Berengar grabbed a hold of Adela's dainty hand and led her down to the beach, where the couple walked along the soft sand barefoot while gazing up at the moon and the stars above. Berengar had a lot to say on his mind to the girl before they returned home, and would not see each other for some time. Thus Berengar immediately turned around, and looked Adela in the eyes while conveying his thoughts. "I am sorry." Adela was slightly confused when she heard this, and as such, she asked for clarification. "For what?" Berengar sighed heavily before revealing the regrets he had contained deep within his heart since the first time he cheated on his little fiancée. "For starters, I am sorry I am such a piece of shit. We were engaged and set to be a happy couple, and like every relationship I have ever had with another person, I had to fuck it up. I couldn't keep my urges to myself, and I slept with Lind, then I lied to you repeatedly about it. When my lies were finally exposed, you stuck beside me, and I ended up repaying your kindness by taking in another girl before I ever had the chance to be with you. I know it doesn't change anything, I have to take responsibility for my actions after all." I just wanted you to know that I am sorry for treating you so poorly and forcing you to go along with my selfish desires. Adela looked at Berengar with a complicated gaze. She took this statement as Berengar's way of admitting he had already slept with Honoria, which she did not know about until now. As such, she looked away from Berengar before asking the question on her mind. Berengar, be honest with me. Why did you take me on this trip? You seem to have handled everything on your own the entire time. Berengar sighed before gazing off into the moonlight. After doing so for a few moments, he smiled bitterly before revealing his thought process on the matter. I wanted to spend some quality time with you. Since you departed from Kufstein, I have not spent as much time with you as I would have liked. I honestly had no idea we would be caught in a conspiracy and have to witness such horrific scenes. I am sorry for that as well. If I had known such a thing would have happened, I never would have brought you here. Adela sighed heavily before lying down on the beach and staring up at the stars. Berengar took the hint and lay down next to her, where Adela grabbed a hold of his hand and said with a bitter smile on her face. One more year? Just one more year, and we can finally get married. Berengar could see the tiny tear forming in the girl's sapphire eyes as she said this, and as such, he forced a smile upon his face as he spoke the truth. I look forward to it. After saying that, the couple had a long conversation on the beach. What exactly was said on that fateful night has been lost to history. However, one thing was certain: the relationship between Adela and Berniger improved afterward. Chapter 280 God's Gift to the World. Weeks had passed since Berengar returned to Kufstein, and during this time, he had been focused on expanding his naval capacity. Compared to the Venetian arsenal, he still lacked output, even though he had 3 shipyards equal in scale, if not more significant. The reason for this was simple: a lack of experience on the part of the workers who created the ships from the prefabricated components. The Venetians had centuries of experience building vessels, and as such, they could crank out a single ship every day. Whether or not they could manufacture the cannons necessary to equip these vessels was another story. After all, they were using relatively small-bore primitive bronze cannons at this point. Bronze is a much rarer material than iron, and of course, more expensive. The Venetian warships also lacked broadside cannons, with their armaments exclusively being located at the fore and aft positions. Compared to the Venetian arsenal, Berengar's shipyards in Trieste and Pola, dedicated to naval armament, were only capable of producing 1 ship every 4 days. However, these ships were 5th-rate frigates with a total of 44 24-pound cannons on board. As such, his navy began to expand rapidly in terms of the number of vessels available, and thus Berengar had to boost recruitment efforts towards his navy. As for his merchant fleet, it was also growing rapidly, with 1 clipper being built every 3 days. While naval power was necessary to secure his dominion over the region, a properly established merchant fleet was necessary to establish trade across the Mediterranean. At the moment, Berengar's Grand Army was 50,000 strong and was the most well-equipped and trained army in all of Europe. However, his navy severely lacked comparison, with only 10,000 recruits over the past year, which was barely enough to field 45 vessels. At the moment, Berengar was in the middle of implementing an essential resource to his naval vessels. He was honestly surprised that he had not thought of such a thing before. His vessels were currently using inferior hemp rope, and he was planning to improve it with superior manila rope when he reached the Philippines, much like how the Spanish had done in his previous life. However, Berengar came to a sudden realization that he had a far more valuable resource and a vast stockpile of it that could be utilized in the manufacture of rope for sailing vessels. This material was, of course, high-carbon steel. Beginning in the 1830s of Berengar's previous life, steel wire rope had started to replace the traditional manila rope used by most sailing vessels. The reason for this was that steel wire rope was superior in strength, durability, and flexibility compared to textile rope. Due to the advancements in steel-making technology and the massive supply the Europeans were able to produce during this time, they used such materials to improve the rigging of their sailing vessels. As such, Berengar had begun to place an order to construct high-carbon galvanized steel wire where it would be converted into ropes for sailing and replace the existing hemp ropes that were used on what few vessels Berengar had available. It was best to make these innovations as early as possible. As such, Berengar had begun to implement them for all new vessels in the future. He also planned to convert the ropes on the existing ships as quickly as he could manage. After drafting the designs and sending them to his industrial district within Trieste via a courier, Berengar sat back and relaxed in his dining hall. Just when he was about to sip some tea, he received some shocking news from one of his servants who had appeared before him. "Your Grace, Sir Andronikos of the Byzantine Empire is here to speak with you." Upon hearing this, Berengar sighed before getting up from his seat and approaching the great hall, leaving behind his tea in the process. When Berengar arrived, the man from the east had a broad smile on his face as he greeted the young Duke of Austria. "Your Grace, it is good to see that you are well." Berengar put on a smile as he greeted the man who had long since become his primary means of trade with the East since Arethes had become engaged in his campaign for North Africa. "And you as well, my friend, tell me, how is the war effort going in Egypt and Libya?" Andronikos sighed as he heard this question and revealed the results of the ongoing campaign. "For the most part, it is going well. We have seized a quarter of Egypt and Libya and are currently expanding forward. However, the Knights Hospitaller, who has supported us for some time, has begun to withdraw. Those fanatics realized that we were being supplied by Austria and immediately became offended. Stating it was either you or them, we chose your support. Seeing as your weapons are superior to the men they provide for the war effort." Berengar chuckled at this comment before shifting the conversation to the issue at hand. "Tell me, Andronikos, why are you here in Kufstein?" The Byzantine man smiled before pulling out a ceramic jar. He revealed the contents within after opening it. Berengar was shocked when he saw what was inside the container. Small dark brown beans that Berengar instantly recognized. The young duke's eyes grew wide with excitement when he saw what was in front of him. As such, he grabbed a hold of one of the beans and sniffed it to make sure he was not dreaming. What Andronikos had brought him was something he had desired since he arrived in this world. It was none other than coffee. As such, Berengar immediately inquired about where Andronikos had gotten such a thing. "Tell me, my friend, where did you get this?" Andronikos was surprised that Berengar asked where he obtained the coffee beans, not what they were. Nevertheless, he began to inform Berengar of his recent discovery. "Not long ago, I was invited to Ethiopia by one of the local noblemen. When I arrived, I was served this bitter tea, except it wasn't tea, and it provided substantial benefits such as an increase in energy and focus. The Ethiopians explained to me that this is God's gift to the world, and they call it coffee. Naturally, I bought an ample supply of it, and the first thing I thought of when I returned home was the potential that such a product has. While we in the Empire have access to the trade routes in the Mediterranean, it would be difficult for us to sell the substance further into Europe. As such, I thought of a trading partner with a significant deal of reach further inland, and immediately your name came to mind. Allow me to brew a drink for you to see for yourself how excellent this product is. If you enjoy it and think it has as much potential as I do, we can discuss importing it into Kufstein, where you can resell it to the rest of Europe." Berengar naturally accepted his offer and led the man to the kitchen, where he ground the beans into a fine powder before boiling water and adding it through the filter to create a cup of coffee. Berengar tasted the bitter black substance with a smile on his face while nodding his head. "It is wonderful, but don't you think it would taste better with something added to it? Maybe some milk and sugar?" Andronikos had not thought about this, and as such, was interested in the topic. Therefore Berengar made a mixture of the coffee with milk and sugar added to it before handing a cup to Andronikos. After the man sipped from the ceramic cup, his eyes widened, and a giant smile formed on his face. "This tastes so much better than the coffee by itself. Your Grace, you are a genius." After hearing this, Berengar merely smiled in silence and drank from his cup of coffee. Finally, he had acquired one of the many things he missed from his previous life in the 21st century. After the two men had drunk their fair share of coffee, Berengar began to speak to Andronikos about his decision. "I will buy as much of the material as you can give me, and I would be more than happy to sell it across Austria and the neighboring regions. Considering your lack in trade routes to the north, the two of us combined can sell this fine substance across all of Europe and make a major profit off of it." After hearing this, Andronikos smiled. The remaining details about what the cost was for importing the coffee and what Berengar would resell it at was negotiated over a breakfast, where Berengar and Andronikos introduced coffee to Lind, Honoria, and Henrietta, all three of which fell in love with the drink. With milk and sugar added to the mix, coffee would become a desirable commodity within Europe in due time. Both Austria and the Byzantine Empire would make a fortune off of the monopoly they would establish over the substance. After all, few in Europe had contact with Ethiopia and were unaware of where the strange drink originated from. Berengar was delighted to know that by supplying the Byzantines with arms in this timeline, they were capable of recapturing large swaths of Egypt and Libya, where they immediately took advantage of the newly gained territory to send trade expeditions into Africa, in doing so bringing coffee to Europe over a century earlier than it had been done in his previous life's history. Chapter 281 War of Attrition. Eckhard gazed upon the remains of the battlefield. Corpses littered the valley, belonging to both sides of the conflict in the thousands. Hussites and Catholics alike lie dead for the sake of their religious convictions. The battle was bloody and brutal, yet in the end, the Hussites had won. During this last year of conflict, the violence that had occurred in Bohemia was on a scale truly fitting of a religious civil war. Eckhard, as the chief military advisor tasked with providing support to the Hussites, had witnessed the cruelty of man at its full scale, and for what? Minor religious differences? The sheer level of savagery committed by both sides of the conflict was enough for a man to question his faith. Did God genuinely desire such death and destruction in his name? Probably not, but if the idea of such actions reviled him, why did he permit it? These were thoughts going through the field marshal's head as he stood by his lonesome, observing the despair that resulted from the chaotic battle. Eckhard sighed heavily as he voiced his innermost thoughts on the issue. I have seen enough of death and destruction in my lifetime. Despite saying this, the veteran field marshal would continue his duties serving as Berengar's lead general, for war was an inevitable result of man's actions. It was also the only thing the man was any good at. After praying for the souls of the fallen, Eckhard returned to the other officers of the Grand Army of Austria who had accompanied him during the Hussite campaign. Berengar's strategy had been to stall the conflict for as long as possible and dragged as many Catholics to their deaths to delay the upcoming crusade against the Berengar heresy. Eckhard did not disappoint on this matter. He advised the Hussites to slow down their forces and consolidate their gains over the past year. As such, the Hussites had less land than they could have seized. However, these lands were well fortified and defended. Several months ago, the Pope declared a crusade against the Hussites because they were becoming increasingly close to overall victory. As such, the crusading orders of the world had gathered what few men they could spare to put down the Hussite heresy before they could cause any further damage. Among these Catholic military orders was the Bohemian Order of the Dragon, which had made a name for itself for the sheer acts of brutality they engaged in against the Hussites, and especially the people who supported them. At the moment, the banner of the order lay tattered and broken alongside the thousands of corpses of their fallen soldiers. The Hussite force had thoroughly crushed the latter under the guidance of Eckhard and his military advisors. Eckhard gazed upon the once proud banner of the chivalric order who had lost their lives in battle, particularly that of the Grand Master whose lifeless eyes gazed towards the heavens as blood dripped from his mouth onto his beard. In this single battle, the main force of the Order of the Dragon was crushed, snuffed out before they could make a name for themselves like the outstanding orders established centuries ago. Despite this, Eckhard knew this would not be the end of Bohemian Knights. The Order of the Dragon was not to be confused with the Welsh Order of the Red Dragon, which the Vatican recently established to counteract the Berengar heresy. This was a much older chivalric order found in Bohemia, Hungary, and Wallachia. They would return in time with more significant numbers to attack the Hussites. Eckhard was sure of this. After taking one last glance at the blood and bile that filled the field, Eckhard shifted his attention to his officers nearby before speaking to them with a voice filled with determination. This is just one of many battles that await us. This war will not end anytime soon. Steel yourselves, for we have much work to do. After saying that, Eckhard approached the command tent where Alexei and the other Hussite leaders were gathered. Having stepped inside the dwelling, the Hussite leaders glanced over at Eckhard. They held much respect for the Austrian field marshal. After all, if not for him and his officers, they could have suffered substantially more casualties throughout this war. The leaders of the Hussites who were standing in the tent were encircled around a table filled with a map of Bohemia and the forces that represented both sides. Under Eckhard's guidance, the Hussites had taken a firm defensive stance, and as such, mainly was engaging in battles within their provinces. At the moment, the Hussites held 4 out of 7 provinces of the Kingdom of Bohemia. Through their best efforts and the advice of Eckhard, the Hussites had gained significant ground. This battle that had just occurred was fought in the fields of Plzeň, where the Hussites had defeated an army of Catholic soldiers. Plzeň was a region owned by one of the Hussite factions, and the Kasparians had responded to their aid after a Catholic army was spotted in their lands. Through much hardship, a victory was achieved defending the ground, but it came at high costs. Ultimately, the Kasparian armies arrived and drove their enemies out, slaughtering all who dared to attack the peasants of Plzeň and their farms. Alexei, who had personally led his forces into the fray, was currently displaying the latest report from his scouts about the enemy's movements. The main force of the Order of the Dragon has been defeated. They will probably crawl back to Hungary to lick their wounds until they can fight once more. However, news from the other side of the world is troublesome. The Hospitallers have cut off support from the Byzantine armies in Egypt and Libya. They have withdrawn from their crusade in North Africa and pledged support to the Catholics in Bohemia. As such, tens of thousands of crusaders now march towards our lands. The army is meant for a single purpose: to destroy our movement and massacre every man, woman, and child they deem to be a heretic. Eckhard observed the map closely. With the Hospitaller knights entering the fray, this meant things would become difficult. They were a large and prestigious order and were also battle-hardened from the decades of warfare in North Africa. He would have to readjust his strategy if such a quantity of crusaders were to pour into the war. The veteran field marshal approached the map and began to shift the pieces around without permission from the others. He moved several wooden pieces that represented Hussite troops into positions near the borders and the various fortifications that guarded them. After doing so, he spoke with determination and authority. The Hospitallers have entered Bohemia, which means we will be fighting thousands if not tens of thousands of more men. To put it simply, gaining any further ground is unlikely. What we need to do is defend our borders to the best of our ability and wear down the Catholics' numbers through attrition. As of now, we are fighting a defensive war. Our best course of action is to maintain the ground we have gained while sending operatives into the enemy territory to sabotage their fields and food stockpiles. It may take months or even years, but sooner or later, the enemy will break their backs against our defenses and starve into submission. There was not a single voice of disagreement at the conference. The Hussite commanders were all well aware that the arrival of the Hospitallers represented a shift in the balance of power, and as such, fighting on these terms was their best solution. The war in Bohemia began to take a turn for the worse. The Hussites decided to engage in a series of protracted sieges while meeting the enemy in the fields of their territory to protect their citizens. The Catholics, overzealous and eager for vengeance, would slowly use their newfound strength to push into Hussite lands. When this war of attrition waged, the Hussites would further import weapons, munitions, and food from Austria, racking up an enormous debt. The larger the debt, the more land Berengar would demand as a form of repayment. The silver mines of Bohemia were a valuable resource, and as Berengar's economy grew, it also began to stagnate due to a lack of currency. Thus, he needed the mines in Bohemia to stimulate his nation's growth until he could start his colonization of the New World and Africa. Unknowingly, the Hussites had begun to trap themselves in debt to Austria, in doing so sealing their fates. Berengar had not only sent his advisors to aid the Hussites but to ensure that the Hussites incurred more significant debt, one that could only be repaid with valuable land. If the Hussites refused to surrender Bohemia to Austria after the war, Berengar would use the debt as a valid casus belli to take what he wanted. To him, the war in Bohemia was of great importance to funding his future campaigns to unify the German people. Chapter 282: Reuniting with an Old Friend. Since Honoria's escape from Constantinople, Melissa had been staying in Antioch under the name of Vistula Maladia. Throughout this entire time, the Byzantine royal family was unable to determine her real identity or that she had aided Honoria in her escape. As such, she made a life for herself in Antioch. Having been given a second chance at life, Melissa did not go back to whoring herself out for a living. Instead, she eventually found herself married to a hard-working carpenter in the city. Initially, she had spent her days in bliss. Her marriage was a happy one at first, and she loved the man who had taken her in when she was down on her luck. However, happiness never truly lasts, and as such, Melissa's husband soon found himself drafted into the armed forces to fight in North Africa. The meager pay that the man earned in the armies of the Byzantine Empire was sent back to Melissa in Antioch. However, this stipend was barely enough to survive. As such, her life was filled with hardship as she struggled to maintain her lifestyle. Things turned for the worse as the young woman finally received news that her husband had died in battle. In return, she received nothing other than a body to bury, and with her little savings, she could not afford a proper funeral. Thus, in the act of desperation, she had taken out a loan from some unsavory merchants and used it to cover her husband's funeral expenses. Before long, the loan sharks had come to claim the debt she owed, and when they found out that she could not pay it, they attempted to force her into prostitution once more to clear the debt that she owed. However, Melissa had promised that she would never degrade herself in such a manner ever again. As such, she packed up what little belongings she could take and made her way out of Antioch, heading to the one place where she knew anyone who could remotely help her. After months of traveling, Melissa had finally arrived in Kufstein. The moment she entered the city's gates, the woman was astounded that such a magnificent city had been developed in the middle of Austria. A place that was not long ago considered a backwater by the Byzantines. She could hardly believe her eyes as she walked through the city with her pack slung around her back. The city of Kufstein was unlike anything she thought it would be. It even could be said to rival some of the cities of the empire. After searching around some of the local shops in the trade district, Melissa spotted the location where she intended to visit. Luckily for her, she could immediately tell her destination because the castle was built upon a hill overlooking the city. After traveling through the city's streets observing all kinds of exciting sights, Melissa finally arrived at the castle's gates. However, when she finally reached her destination, she was blocked by the castle garrison, who prevented her entry into the mighty fortress where the Duke resided. Hold it right there, the Duke is currently not seeing any visitors, so unless you have an invitation, you are not allowed into the castle. The moment Melissa heard this, she began to frown. She had been through so much and traveled so far that she felt it was a bit anticlimactic to be denied entry just like this. However, she could not easily get past the garrison, and as such, she began to sigh before turning around. Maybe if she were lucky, she could run into Honoria on the street someday. Whether it was divine intervention or just random chance, Honoria had been out in the city meeting with her newest acquisitions to her crew and had just begun to return to the castle. The last time Honoria saw the woman known as Melissa, she wore a wig and extensive makeup. Despite this, the princess could easily identify the woman as they walked past each other. As such, Honoria stopped in her tracks and grabbed a hold of the woman's wrist, scaring her in the process. Yet the next moment when Honoria called out her name, the woman realized who it was who had grabbed her and began to calm herself. "Melissa, is that you? What are you doing here in Kufstein?" After saying that, Honoria brought the woman into a friendly hug before releasing her. Melissa was quite shocked that she had managed to run into Honoria out of pure chance and struggled to gain her composure. Eventually, she calmed herself down before voicing her concerns to the young princess she had helped run away from home. "Honoria, I need your help." Seeing the troubled look in Melissa's eyes, Honoria became worried and grabbed a hold of the woman's hand before dragging her towards the castle with a pretty smile on her face. "Whatever kind of trouble you are in, I am sure that Berengar can help you." When the guards saw the girl return, they were about to lower their rifles in a threatening gesture. However, they immediately pounded their chests in salute to the Duke's lover when they noticed Honoria was by her side. "Lady Valeria, I am sorry we did not know this woman was your friend. I apologize on behalf of myself and my subordinates for any rudeness we might have shown her." Honoria paid no mind to the guards' statements. In her eyes, they were doing their job, keeping away the rabble and threats to the safety of those who dwelled within. As such, she smiled when responding to the men who guarded the castle's gates. "Think nothing of it, I am certain you were fulfilling the task His Grace has given you." Seeing the cheery smile on the princess's face was enough to melt even the most stoic man's icy heart. If there was one thing the guards in Kufstein Castle liked to chat about, it was the competition between the two goddesses who stayed by Berengar's side and which of the two women were better. As such, the guards were just happy to have a conversation with such an angelic beauty and merely nodded their heads in silence, allowing Honoria and Melissa to enter the castle's gates. After entering the structure, Honoria took Melissa to the dining hall, where she ordered the kitchen staff to prepare something for the woman to eat and drink. The two women sat in silence for some time before the food arrived, and they finally began to discuss the issue at hand. After taking a few bites of the delicious food, Melissa began to break out into tears as she confessed her faults to the princess. "I am sorry, Honoria, I just had nowhere else to go." Honoria instantly began to comfort the woman by rubbing her back. the two of them discussed the events that Melissa had been through in the past year in length for some time. Afterward, Honoria responded to Melissa with a gentle tone. "If you need a place to stay, I am sure I can get Berengar to arrange a place for you. If you need a job, there is plenty of work available here in Kufstein. If you need the training to fulfill the job of your desires, that can be provided to you as well. You do not need to worry anymore. Here in Kufstein, even women can work if they need to." What Honoria had said was true. Women were able to work in Kufstein. However, they were encouraged to get married, stay home, and raise families. The reason for this was simple. Berengar needed massive population growth if he intended to colonize the New World and Africa. There were only so many people in all German-speaking regions. The number was likely less than 10 million in total. However, Berengar recognized that there were women in situations where they too needed to work to provide for their families or themselves. As such, Berengar had allowed women to work in various fields, albeit segregated from the male workforce. When Melissa heard this, she stopped crying and looked at Honoria with a careful gaze. She could hardly believe it. However, the earnest look in Honoria's mint-green eyes told the woman all she needed to know about this, and as such, she hugged Honoria before thanking her. "Thank you. I will appreciate any help you can provide." Honoria had reunited with an old friend, and Melissa would begin working in Kufstein soon enough, in a career that did not degrade her, which was all she ever wanted. The two women continued to chat for some time, as Honoria told Melissa all about what had happened during her stay in Kufstein and how she had fallen in love with Berengar. Melissa was happy to see that life had worked out well for Honoria, and thus the two women became closer. Despite this being the second time they had met, they already felt as if they had been friends for life. Chapter 283 Fertility Incentives. Once more, Berengar was in his study, which was where he spent most of his waking hours when he was at home. He was drafting a piece of legislation designed to encourage fertility among the Austrian population. The reason for him doing so was because he was looking towards the future. Within the upcoming decades, Berengar had intended to conquer and colonize large swaths of land across the world and inhabit it with German citizens. However, the German population at this time was low. It was at most between 10 to 15 million people, and due to the ongoing conflict, those numbers dwindled by the day. As such, Berengar had established several laws designed to create strong families that could raise multiple children. First and foremost, Berengar established both paid paternity and maternity leave. To Berengar, the physical and mental health of the next generation was a critical concern. Berengar had based several laws on the Scandinavian countries from his past life, who had some of the best welfare laws on the books. Parents of a child were entitled to up to 480 days of paid leave to raise a newborn child. Of course, this was the maximum based on specific requirements. A typical two-parent household was likely to get 240 days of paid leave. Berengar's other laws to help raise fertility rates included a monthly stipend for every child a family had to help with childcare costs and what Berengar liked to refer to as a child starter pack. This starter pack was based upon what the Finnish government provided expecting mothers in his previous life. The state provided this child starter pack to every expecting mother, which included a crib with a mattress, clothes, diapers, hygiene products, a sleeping bag, and outdoor gear. It also had a few small toys and a propaganda book for the parents to read to the children, which contained whitewashed children's stories of Berengar's conquests and goals. Several sanitary measures were required by law that was put into place during childbirth, especially regarding washing one's hands and sterilizing tools used in the process. Berengar wanted to lower the child mortality rate to the best of his ability and had devised laws and procedures to achieve this goal. After this comprehensive reform was signed into law under his executive powers, Berengar decided to relax for the time being. He already had 2 children, a son and a daughter with Lind, and it would not be long before Honoria came around to the idea of having children. However, Berengar wanted to prevent that until after he married Adela and had a child with her. He felt terrible for the girl always coming in last place among his women, and as such, was willing to wait for some time with Honoria. Another reason for this was a matter of legitimacy. Until Berengar married Adela as his first wife, he could not enact polygamy for himself as the ruler of his realm and therefore could not marry either Lind or Adela as his other wives. Thus at the moment, Linda's children were nothing more than bastards. Berengar would have to wait another year before he married their mother and legitimized them. Reflecting upon this, Berengar decided to pour himself a glass of fortified wine, immediately drinking its contents before pouring himself another. As he did so, he heard a knock on his door and knew it could only be one of two people. As such, he sighed heavily before responding. "It's open." After the door opened, Honoria revealed herself, and in tow was a woman Berengar had not met before. However, at first glance, the two women appeared to be close. The moment Honoria entered the room, she put on a pleading expression as she asked her lover for a favor. "Berengar, this is Melissa. She helped me escape from Constantinople and has fallen on some rough times. She has recently arrived in Kufstein and has no place to stay, nor any currency left over from her journey. Could you help her out?" After hearing this, Berengar took a sip from his skull chalice once more before reaching into his desk and pulling out a token, where he proceeded to hand it over to Honoria. This token had the new ducal arms of Berengar's house carved into it and symbolized his authority. After handing this token over to his lover, Berengar sighed before responding to her request. "Show that to the landlord of whatever tenement she desires to move into, and also to whatever employer she seeks to work for. The treasury will pay out any costs accrued during her moving expenses. It is the least I can do for a friend of yours who aided you on your journey." Melissa was shocked when she heard this. However, Honoria's actions startled her even more as the princess ran up to Berengar and hugged him before planting a kiss on his lips. Afterward, she responded in an affectionate tone. "Thanks, Daddy." Berengar cringed when he heard this. For whatever reason, Honoria had begun to call him this after they started dating. It was pretty embarrassing for Berengar, but he supposed it was not too inaccurate. In a way, he provided for Honoria and looked after her as a father figure that she could look up to over this last year. Of course, the moment Honoria realized she had called Berengar by his pet name in front of Melissa, she began to flush with embarrassment. She had forgotten entirely that Melissa was present and said something shameful in front of her friend. If Lind called Berengar by the title Master in private, and Honoria referred to him as Daddy, then Berengar dreaded the idea of what embarrassing pet name Adela would give him after they were finally married. Berengar did not show it upon his face. As a ruler, he had to be dignified in all situations, and since they were not alone, he had a stoic expression on his face as he flicked Honoria on the forehead before chastising her. "Behave yourself while we have company." When Honoria heard this, she bowed her head, too embarrassed to look her lover or her friend in the eyes. After a few moments of silence, Berengar gave Honoria an order. "You've taken up enough of my time. Go find your friend a place to stay and a job so that she can sustain herself. While you are at it, find yourself the rest of your crew members." Honoria nodded before thanking Berengar one final time with a kiss on the cheek. Afterward, she left with Melissa in tow, leaving Berengar by his lonesome. Though not for long, as Lind appeared shortly after and began to mock him. "Daddy? Wow, I did not know you were into that kind of thing." She had been hiding in the shadows outside the door to his study the entire time, and as such, heard the conversation. Berengar smiled before grabbing a hold of his other lover and pulling her into his lap. "Funny, I don't remember giving you permission to mock me?" When Lind heard this, her training took over, and she instantly bowed her head in remorse before playing along to Berengar's games. "I am sorry, Master. Please forgive this rude slave for not knowing her place." As Berengar heard this, he began to chuckle before pushing Lind off of his lap. He knew what she wanted, but he was far too busy to entertain her desires. As such, he slapped her on her perfect behind before giving her a command. "I am far too busy to entertain you right now. Go play with yourself. I promise that tonight you can have me as much as you want." In response to this, Lind began to pout, but she did not make a fuss. Instead, she smiled before commenting on Berengar's remarks. "I am going to hold you to that." With that said, she disappeared from Berengar's sight, leaving him alone in his study with nothing but a mountain of paperwork to get through. Gazing upon the large stack of paperwork in front of him, Berengar sighed heavily before pulling another document from the pile and beginning to read through it. He sighed to himself as he voiced his discontent with his current lot in life. Some people say peace is a desirable state, and for the people, I assume it is. To me, it is nothing but paperwork, and paperwork is dreadfully boring. As such, Berengar continued to fulfill his daily work well into the night, burning the midnight oil as per usual. It was well past midnight by the time he was able to fulfill his promise to Lind. Luckily for him, he had the stamina of a horse and could perform as long as Lind needed. By morning Berengar was dreadfully exhausted and decided for once in his life to sleep in. As such, it would not be until past noon when he finally awoke from his slumber and was forced to resume his work. Chapter 284 Appointing an Admiral. The sun shined down upon the Adriatic Sea. Off the coast of Trieste, there were a total of 10 frigates lined up. These ships were among the largest available in Europe, and each held 44 24-pound cannons on board. These ships were none other than the Berengar-class frigates that had been manufactured since the shipyards had finished construction. These ships were crewed by hundreds if not thousands of men. Among them were various officers, many of whom had shown a tacit understanding of naval doctrine and tactics since the establishment of the Navy. Berengar had spared no expense in raising sailors, marines, and officers alike in the construction of his navy. He had even begun construction of a naval academy in Trieste, though for the time being the officers underwent the same crash course of warfare and doctrine that their counterparts in the army went over. The difference was that the curriculum was specially tailored for the navy. Among the ranks of these fine officers was a minor Austrian nobleman by the name of Emmerich von Lotzing. This man had proven time and again his capability in learning and employing naval doctrine. So much so that he had caught Berengar's eye. The Duchy of Austria held a relatively large territory, and as such, there were plenty of talented individuals within the realm. Some of them had potential in areas that had yet to be established. Emmerich was one of these men. Until recently, there was no such thing as an Austrian navy, and as such, the man had no idea the degree of natural talent he had for naval warfare. However, after enlisting in the Austrian navy and going through basic training as well as officer school, none stood out as much as Emmerich had. One could say that Emmerich had the same level of potential in the field of naval warfare that Eckhard had on the land. The difference was that Emmerich was considerably younger than Eckhard and less experienced. Berengar gazed at the sailors and officers gathered for this occasion and smiled upon them. These men were the first among his naval personnel, and as such, they would form the backbone of his vision for a grand armada. As he stood there smiling before his soldiers, Berengar began to clear his throat before addressing the men in uniform. I stand before each, and every one of you humbled as I admire the spirit that has driven you to the lengths you have achieved this day. These few vessels that have been constructed are just the beginning of your journey as members of the Austrian Navy. In the upcoming years, we will expand the number of vessels under our control and the size of them as well. These frigates are just a sample of the advancements in naval technology that have come to be under my reign. Before long, there will be no force on this great earth that can stand against you. The amount of firepower you all have available to you at the moment pales in comparison to what you will wield in the future. Today is a joyous occasion as it marks the establishment of the first Austrian fleet that will be stationed here in Trieste. With the establishment of the first fleet, there needs to be a man to command it, and though all of the officers among your ranks have proven yourselves capable in your own right, ultimately the position of admiral has fallen to one man in particular. Emmerich von Lotzing, step forward. The moment Berengar made this decree, the man in question did as he was ordered and stood before Berengar. He was dressed in the typical uniform afforded to an officer in Berengar's navy. The colors, in particular, were black, charcoal and gold. When compared to Eckhard, he was considerably younger. Emmerich was in his early 30s. He was a tall and fit man with a robust bone structure that showed itself in his face. He had short brown hair and a matching beard. The man stood at attention, saluting Berengar as he waited for the Duke to convey his thoughts. As such, Berengar began to express his reasoning for selecting Emmerich as the admiral of his navy. Emmerich von Lotzing, out of all of my naval officers, you have stood out as the most exceptional. Your talent for naval warfare and your understanding of the tactics I have presented in your learning material has shocked me. I believe it is no exaggeration to say that you command the respect of the sailors and officers alike, and as such, I see no reason not to present you with the rank of admiral. After saying this, Berengar presented the man with a ceremonial sword. This ceremonial sword was also functional and had been designed around the sword that his army used. The hilt was protected by the same intricate guard based upon the British 1788 heavy cavalry sword from his previous life. However, there was one considerable difference. The blade was based upon the US 1860 naval cutlass from Berengar's past life. Unlike the sword utilized by the army, This weapon had a single-edged, curved blade. This blade was made out of Damascus steel imported from the east, while the hilt was constructed of black leather, wrapped in a gold wire. The guard itself was made from brass. This sword was the symbol of the admiral's authority, and as such, the man unsheathed the blade and inspected it in front of his sailors. After doing so, a round of applause erupted, with Berengar himself congratulating the man on his rise to such a prominent position. Berengar placed his hand on the man's shoulder after sheathed the sword and stowed it away. With a gentle smile on his face, Berengar spoke to the man in a soothing tone. "I expect great things from you, Emmerich. The world is vast and filled with unfathomable depths. It is your job to conquer the oceans in the name of Austria. The road ahead is a difficult one, but with my backing, I am certain that you will rise to the occasion and make our nation proud." Having heard this, Emmerich nodded his head with a stoic expression and expressed his thanks. "Thank you, Your Grace. I shall remember the kindness you have shown me this day." However, Berengar responded unexpectedly as he shook his head and lectured the man. "Don't thank me, thank your effort and your God-given talent. You have earned this." After saying this, a band began to play the song, Kameraden auf See. It was a German naval song from his previous life and had a relatively upbeat sound. As such, Berengar thought it was perfect for this occasion and had given the sheet music to the naval band to play at the ceremony. As the band played the song, a small parade began to celebrate the occasion. As such, Berengar stood next to Emmerich as the two men watched the display of festivities. Emmerich had no idea that Berengar had prepared such an excessive event for what he thought was just a minor occasion. Berengar had a flair for extravagance, and a naval parade could very quickly be used as a propaganda piece. As such, he had decided to make proper use of this occasion to display the brilliance of the Austrian navy. The Austrian banners and flag that Berengar had created were being waved in the parade, and the people of Trieste had gathered to witness the event. Sailors, soldiers, and citizens alike had begun to watch on the sides as the Austrian naval personnel celebrated the occasion. At the head of the parade watching over the event were Berengar and Emmerich. Despite the festivities and the loud sounds it produced, Berengar managed to lean over and whisper to his new admiral. "Magnificent, isn't it? Just wait until you see what I have in store for the future of the navy." While Emmerich knew that Berengar intended to expand the navy substantially, he had no idea that Berengar intended to become the world's supreme naval power, much like Britain had managed to accomplish in his past life. To Berengar, his future German empire would need a powerful navy to maintain control over its many colonies. As such, he intended to create the largest and most powerful navy in the world. Besides, with his current technological capabilities, it would be generations before the rest of the world caught up to the present might of his vessels. By then, the German navy could be filled with ironclads. Whether or not Berniger would be able to live long enough to see such a future was another story. After all, producing an industrial society powered by steam engines was a far-off goal and was not easily achieved in a single lifetime. Thus Berengar watched on with a broad smile as the naval parade continued, envisioning the future of his Grand Armada within his mind and the dominance he believed it would have over the world. He had learned from his previous life's history. He knew for Germany to become the preeminent global power, it would need the ability to project force around the globe, and the only way to do that was with a powerful navy.